Sound returned first. The low rumble of a bell fell from above and settled deep in his bones. Ray Olvin opened his eyes and saw his palms. The scar on his left hand was gone. His skin was smooth and clear. His nails were short. His wrist was slender. He clenched his fingers and unclenched them again. His body obeyed him too easily. There was not a single trace of his old pain. He raised his head. Above him stood a vault of white stone and blue glass. 64 seals ran around the circumference of the vault. He knew this vault. He knew every crack in the third column on the left. The Hall of Seals at Helmvar Academy. He stood in the general ranks, wearing a gray student cloak without any insignia. 60 people were breathing and shifting their weight nearby. They were all alive. He counted them twice and came up with the same number. Then he lowered his gaze to the marble in front of the dais. A date was engraved there. The 13th day of the month of gold. The day of awakening. He stood exactly where he had stood that time. He exhaled slowly. The air flowed back in evenly. Not a single muscle in his face twitched. Ahead, on the dais, lay the seal. A circle of black metal 3 steps wide. Lines glowed inside the circle. The administrator, Halden Work, stood beside it, a journal in his hands. He was younger. He still had hair. Ray looked at him and counted the beats of his own heart. 42, 43. His heart was beating steadily. Halden Work raised his hand and the hall fell silent. He announced that the seal would accept everyone on the list. He announced that the class was granted once and could not be changed. He announced that the seal's decision could not be challenged, not by lineage, not by gold, not by blood. A murmur ran through the ranks. Someone laughed from the back. Ray recognized that laugh. Dorian Kress was called first. He stepped forward as one would for an award ceremony, not a trial. His cloak was not gray, but lined with scarlet. The House of Kress held 2 mountain passes and 3 mines. Dorian stepped into the circle, and the lines beneath him filled with red. The seal exhaled heat. A scaly shadow unfurled above the circle and took the shape of a wing. Halden Work read from the logbook that Dorian Kress had been awarded the rank of Dragon Knight, rank A. The hall erupted. People clapped and stamped their feet. Dorian raised his hand and held it up longer than necessary. He stepped out of the circle and looked at the formation. He was searching for someone in particular. He found Ray and saw nothing on his face. He didn't like that. The next in line stepped forward. Halden Work called out names, and the seal responded. Selena Morvain stepped into the circle, and the lines turned white until her eyes hurt. A tree of light with 12 branches unfolded above her. She was granted the class of Archmage of the Branches, rank A. She stepped down from the platform without looking at anyone. Tobias Land stood in the circle longer than anyone else. The seal deliberated over him for 8 heartbeats. Then the air in the hall grew sweet and warm, and 3 figures in white appeared above the circle. He was assigned the class of Holy Serere, rank A, marked for special supervision. After that, the hall remained standing. Ray then watched as the rest were assessed. A boy from the outskirts was assigned the class of Wind Spearman and burst into tears right there in the circle. A girl from the trading house was assigned the class of Keeper of the Scales and didn't realize it was a good thing until it was explained to her. 2 in a row were assigned rank D and silently walked to the back of the line where others like them stood. The seal worked like a mill. It processed 60 people in a single hour and produced each of their futures as it spewed them out. No one in that hall could overturn its decision. Except for one person. But that person didn't yet know that he was that person. Halden Work reached the last page and called out the name Ray Olvin. The line parted. Ray walked toward the platform. There were 7 steps. He counted them, and on the 4th, He realized he remembered their number all too precisely. He stepped into the circle. The metal beneath his soles was cold. The lines lit up. They were neither red nor white. They were gray. No one in the hall had ever seen that color before. The seal did not emit any heat. It did not conjure a beast, a tree, or a figure above him. It simply clicked once, like a lock. Halden Work leaned over the journal. He read that line longer than he had read any of the previous ones. Then he announced that Ray Olvin had been assigned the class of Observer. He announced that his rank was undetermined. He announced that he had no active skills. The hall fell completely silent. The silence lasted exactly 7 heartbeats. Ray knew there would be 7. Then someone snorted by the far wall, and the hall erupted in laughter. They weren't laughing maliciously. They were laughing lightly, the kind of laughter you reserve for someone else's misfortune when your own has already passed you by. Dorian Kress was laughing the loudest of all, and made no attempt to hide it. Ray stood in the circle and looked at his gray lines. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't lower his head. He raised his eyes and found 3 faces in the crowd. The first face belonged to Dorian. The second to the appraiser. He saved the third for later. Merrick Gast, the gift appraiser, stepped up to the platform. He was lean and neat and wore gloves even in the heat. He brought out a measuring crystal on a stand and held it up to Ray's chest. The crystal was supposed to fill with color according to the strength of the flow. It remained transparent. Merrick Gast raised an eyebrow and repeated the measurement. The crystal remained transparent. Merrick Gast wiped the facet with a handkerchief and took a third measurement. Nothing. He jotted something down on his sheet and told Halden Work that the device was working properly and that the carrier was registering a 0 reading. He added that in 19 years of service, he had never seen a 0 reading. He said this not with surprise, but with the irritation of a man whose neat report had been ruined. Halden Work asked where to record it. Merrick Gast replied that it should be recorded in the reserve. He explained that the reserve was not a dismissal, but a holding. He explained that the Academy was obligated to keep the carrier until he reached the age of majority and was not obligated to teach him. Ray heard the word holding and committed it to memory separately. He stepped down from the platform. The ranks closed behind him slowly and reluctantly, like water around a rock. Dorian Kress stepped in his path. He said that now it was clear why the seal had taken so long to decide. He said that it had been looking for a place to put the empty space. He said that at dinner, he would order wine in honor of the only person who had received nothing today. He said that Ray should thank him for his attention because no one else would bother to pay him any. The people around them laughed. Ray didn't say anything. He simply memorized the face. Dorian waited 3 seconds for a response and didn't get one. He lost interest and turned away. And that's when he made a mistake. He called on his class to show off. To brag. A wing of red light unfurled over his shoulder and sent a wave of heat toward the ceiling. The hall gasped, and Ray stopped breathing. Because he wasn't seeing a wing, he was seeing markings. A grid lay over the red light. Thin lines ran from his shoulder to his wrist and from his wrist to his shoulder blade. They intersected at nodes. There were many knots, and Ray counted them automatically, just as he had counted lines in other scrolls in his past life. For 9 years, he had transcribed other skills into the archive for a pittance and had learned to see a line before he understood its meaning. Now the line stood before him in the air. The skill grid was alive. A current flowed through it, and the flow wasn't moving freely. In 10 places, the lines were constricted, not broken, constricted, like a tourniquet on an arm, like a tightened valve on a pipe. The flow entered the node wide and emerged from it narrow. Ray watched this and felt his fingers grow cold. He shifted his gaze to Selena Morvain. She was holding a small ball of light in her palm just to keep from getting bored. There was a grid above her palm, too, and it, too, had constrictions. 10 of them. He looked at Tobias Lan. 10. He looked at the boy from the wind spearman class. 10. He looked at the weakest student in the hall and at the strongest and saw the same thing. Different patterns, different strength, the same number of clamps. Exactly 10 for every skill in this hall. That doesn't happen by accident. This was set up. Ray slowly lowered his gaze to the floor. He realized 3 things in quick succession, each worse than the last. First, the observer's class wasn't empty. Second, every skill in this world wasn't operating at full capacity, and no one knew it. Third, if someone had set the clamps, then that someone was still alive. The hum in the hall grew distant. He stood in a crowd that was laughing at him, clutching the number 10 in his mind the way one holds a knife under a cloak. The old man removed his hand from his temple and stepped back from the railing. The archive's overcoat flashed behind a column and vanished into the shadows. Ray took a step forward, but the line had already started moving, and he was swept along with everyone else toward the south doors. When he made his way out onto the gallery, there was no one there. Only dust hung in the slanting light, and the air smelled of old paper. He stood there for 5 heartbeats and then headed downstairs. He didn't run after the old man. Running after someone who's hiding means showing everyone that you need them. He hadn't learned that at the academy. A celebration was underway in the courtyard. Ribbons were being presented to the Dragon Knight. Teachers who hadn't known her that morning were bowing to the Archmage. A cordon of senior students stood around the Holy Summoner because people were trying to reach out and touch his cloak. No one touched Ray. They walked around him as if he were a pole. That was convenient. He reached the reserve wing on the 4th level. The room was narrow. A bunk, a table, a window shutter without glass, a wooden tag with no name hung on the door. He sat down on the bunk and remained motionless until dark. He wasn't thinking about laughter. He was thinking about the number 10. That night, he went out. The training hall on the lower level stayed open until the 3rd watch because the upperclassmen were working out there until they were drenched in sweat. By midnight, the hall had emptied. Ray stood by the farthest post to practice his strike. The post was made of oak, as thick as a man's girth, and sheathed in sheet metal. First-year students practiced the basic strike skill on posts like this. It was the cheapest skill in the academy. They handed it out to everyone indiscriminately, just like they hand out spoons. Ray raised his hand and summoned strike. He expected it to fail. It worked. A grid formed above his fist. Weak, crooked, as thin as a spider web after the rain, but alive. And there were knots in it. He counted them. 10. He stepped closer and began to look. He stared at it for an hour. He didn't try to do anything. He was reading. 9 years of rewriting other people's lines had given him one habit: not to touch the text until he understood where it began. He found the beginning at the base of his wrist. The flow emanated outward from there, and the first knot appeared almost immediately. Ray reached for it with his mind. The knot wouldn't yield. He reached for it with his fingers. His fingers passed right through it. Then he stopped trying and did what he'd done in the archive with that line of someone else's writing that couldn't be erased. He began to rewrite it beside it. He traced the knot's line in the air over and over until he felt resistance. The resistance was dull and viscous, like a knot in a wet rope. He pressed against it until the morning bells rang. The knot didn't come undone. He came into the room as the sky was turning gray and lay face down. Blood was running from his nose. The second night. He didn't press against it. He began searching for a junction in the knot. Every noose has a spot where one end goes under the other. He found it by the third watch and spent the rest of the night threading his own will into it, just as one threads a needle under a seam. The third night, the needle went in. The knot came undone with a dry click that only he could hear. Ray was thrown back from the post and slammed against the spear rack with his back. He lay on the floor staring at the ceiling, and his own markings slowly began to appear there. The first knot had been untied. The flow became twice as wide, and along with that, he received 3 rules. First, he could see the markings only where the skill was being used in his presence or where the skill string was held in his hands. Second, each knot removed doubled the flow. There were 10 knots. 10 removed knots produced a 1,000-fold stream. Third, the carrier's body had to withstand this stream. An F-rank body couldn't even withstand the second stage. And there was a restriction. He discovered it on the 4th night when he tried to touch the mark of another person's skill on a living person. The senior student on duty lit a lantern signal 2 steps away from him. Ray reached for the student's knot, and the grid immediately rippled, while blood began to flow from the senior student's ear. He immediately withdrew his will. The upperclassman cursed and chalked it up to the stifling heat. Ray went into his room and wrote down his conclusion in charcoal on the underside of a shutter. You cannot touch another's markings from a distance. It will tear the carrier apart. Only by touch. Only with his consent. On the 5th night, he returned to the pole with 1 knot untied and decided to test what it was worth. He called on the strike. The grid over his fist was the same, but the current flowing through it was twice as wide, causing the line to tremble. He struck. The post creaked. The cladding burst open at the seam, and the sheet metal peeled outward like a peel. The oak beneath it cracked from the point of impact all the way to the floor. Ray looked at his hand. The skin on his knuckles was intact. He struck a second time lower down and tore a splinter the length of his forearm from the post. He stood there looking at the splinter and, for the first time in 5 nights, allowed himself to exhale fully. Basic strike. The cheapest skill at the academy. 1 knot untied. He turned toward the exit and saw the night watchman, Garm Odd, standing in the doorway of the hall with a lamp in his hand. Garm Odd was fat and old and had worked in the hall for 20 years. His job was to extinguish lamps and record property damage. He walked over to the pillar. He wasn't looking at Ray. He was looking at the crack. He set the lamp on the floor, crouched down, and ran his finger along the cut edge of the oak. Then he touched the curled sheet metal. Then he straightened up and looked down at the pole from above, crouched down again, and touched the cut edge a second time. He did this 3 times. He said these poles had been installed under the previous rector. He said that in 20 years, they'd been drilled through twice, and both times it was done by 4th-year B-rank graduates. He asked Ray what his class was. Ray replied, Observer. Garm Odd looked at his gray patch without insignia, then at the crack, then back at the patch. He picked up the lamp and left without saying another word. And that was when Ray realized his mistake. He looked up at the ceiling of the hall. There, set in an iron frame, hung a measuring crystal. These had been installed in all the Empire's training halls after students began maiming one another during sparring matches. Ray folded the sheet in 4 and tucked it into his belt. He washed his face with cold water, wiped it with his sleeve, and stepped out just as the first bell rang. The evaluation chamber was located in the west wing, behind double doors with scales on the door panels. Inside, it was bright and cold. Merrick Gast sat at a long table, wearing gloves. To his left lay the ceremony log. To his right lay the training hall log. Between them stood a measuring crystal on a stand. The rector was not in the room, and Ray was the first to notice this. Merrick Gast motioned for him to approach the table. He said that the hall's crystal had recorded 8 bursts of power over the past 5 nights. He said that 4 of them were weak and he would not have noticed them. He said the 5th was at the lower limit of rank C, while the 8th had crossed into rank B. He said there was only one name listed in the caretaker's log for those hours. He turned both pages toward Ray so he could see the entries. Then he got to the point. He said that a carrier with a 0 reading is physically incapable of producing a rank B surge. He said that this leads to exactly 2 conclusions, and he doesn't like either of them. Either the ceremony crystal lied, or the hall crystal lied. And in both cases, his signature is on a false reading. Ray realized it wasn't about him. It was about the signature. He gave a stock answer. He said he didn't deny that he had been in the hall. He said he had been practicing the basic strike because reserves aren't allowed to train in forms, and he didn't have any other skills. He said the pillar had been standing there for 20 years, that the metal sheeting on it had been torn even before he arrived, and that the caretaker could confirm this. He said he didn't know how to read the crystal, and that if the device recorded a B rank for a student without a class, the error should be sought in the device, not in the student. Merrick Gast was silent for a long time. He didn't believe it. You could tell by the way he took off his glove and put it back on. But there were 2 documents on his desk, and one of them was personally inconvenient for him. He chose the one that suited him. In the reason for discrepancy column, he wrote, "Possible degradation of the hall's crystal." He summoned a clerk and ordered him to make an entry regarding a scheduled calibration. Then he looked at Ray and told him one thing he didn't need to hear. He said that a reserve does not mean protection. He said that the Academy stores reserve media until the age of majority and then distributes them as needed by the Crown. He said that the boy should keep a low profile because the quiet ones are assigned to archives and warehouses. Ray asked where the noisy ones were assigned. Merrick Gast did not answer. He lowered his gaze at the journal, and Ray saw his finger rest of its own accord on the top line of the right-hand column. The column was titled, "The Wall." Ray left the ward, and in the hallway, for the first time in days, his breath caught in his throat. He pressed his palm against the cold stone and held it there until his breathing evened out. He knew what the wall was. He didn't know it from books. He had 2 years left. Last time, he had 2 years left, and he hadn't even noticed them pass. He pushed off the wall and headed downstairs. Next up was the evaluation. In 9 days, the first year's general combat training would take place, and based on its results, groups would be formed for field exercises. Reservists weren't allowed to participate in the training, but they were required to be present as support staff. Ray decided to use those 9 days to the fullest. First breakthrough. He stopped going to the training hall under the crystal and started going to the old livestock yard behind the laundry, where 3 rotten posts stood and no one ever went after sunset. Second breakthrough. He realized that he could see the patterns not only in combat. He began attending the first-year students' morning drills, sitting on the bottom step and watching as 60 people simultaneously called out their skills. By 4 in the morning, he had read 48 different sequences. He memorized them the way a copyist memorizes handwriting. Third scene. He found a pattern. In all 48, the knots were in the exact same places in the sequence. The first at the stream's outlet, the second at the fork, the third before the cluster, and so on up to the 10th, which was at the very root and was thicker than all the others combined. Fourth cut. He removed the second knot with his strike. It took 3 nights and cost him 2 days of seeing black spots in his eyes. The stream became 4 times wider than the base. He struck a rotten pile, and the pile sank an elbow's length into the ground. He sat down next to it and stared at his hand for a long time. An F-rank body held the second stage, with difficulty, with blood streaming from his nose. But it held. He didn't go for the third. He knew the third would kill him, and that, dead, he wouldn't be able to take revenge on anyone. 2 days before the training session, Dorian Kress found him. He came to the livestock yard with 4 of his men. He said he'd heard a rumor about a cracked pillar. He said the rumor was ridiculous and that he personally checks out ridiculous rumors. He said there would be an exhibition match against the reserves during the training session and that he'd already made arrangements with the instructor. He said he was betting 20 gold pieces on the outcome and that Ray didn't need to bet anything because Ray had nothing. He didn't respond. Ray replied that he agreed. Dorian hadn't expected that and fell silent for a second. Then he laughed and walked away. He didn't put himself forward. He put forward Lance Farah, rank C, Shadowblade class, second place in the fall tryouts among first years. It was a gray and windy day for practice. The parade ground was packed. Combat Hall instructor Ran Toll was calling out the pairs from the list. At the word reserve, he looked up, glanced first at Dorian and then at Ray, understood everything immediately, and allowed the fight to proceed anyway. He said the fight would go until one of them touched the ground or signaled surrender. He said maiming was forbidden. He said this to Lance Fur, not to Ray, and the parade ground erupted in laughter. Lance Fur stepped forward calmly. He called out to his class, and his outline blurred at the edges while the shadow beneath him lengthened. Ray saw him once mark. It was dense and beautiful, and there were 10 knots on it. He knew where the third one was. He knew he couldn't touch it. He didn't need to. Lance Fur stepped into the shadows and emerged from the right. Ray didn't try to guess. He called strike half a second before emerging and struck not at his opponent, but at the ground in front of him. The ground of the parade ground rose up like a wall. Lance Fur crashed into that wall at full speed. He was thrown back 5 steps, fell on his side, and didn't get up right away. Dust hung in the air for a long time. The parade ground was silent. Lance Fur got to his feet. Blood was trickling from his eyebrow. He retreated into the shadows a second time, and Ray struck a second time in the same spot. The wall rose again, and this time Lance Fur was spun through the air and slammed onto his back. He raised his hand in a lying down surrender signal. Ran Toll did not declare the fight over. He stepped down from the platform and approached the crater on the parade ground. He crouched down. He measured it across with his palm. He muttered something under his breath. Then he stood up straight, pulled his measuring rod from behind his belt, and measured the funnel with it. He did this a second time. Then he turned to the scribe and ordered him to read aloud what class was recorded for Ray Olvin. The clerk read, Observer, rank undetermined, no active skills. Ran Toll ordered him to read it again. The clerk read it again. The instructor stood silently over the funnel. He had served for 22 years, and 9 graduating classes had passed through his drill ground, yet he had never asked the clerk to repeat himself twice. He told Ray to come forward. He asked what skill he had been working on. He stood by the bulletin board until the lantern above it burned out. Then he found her himself. Ista Verlin was sitting in the infirmary wing, rolling bandages. She was short and red-headed, and her cloak bore the insignia of a junior medic. Class, Healing Branch. Rank, D, the lowest of those granted the seal that day, aside from his own. Ray said they were in the same group. She replied that she knew and that she'd already seen the lists. He asked how many healing charges she had for the mission. She replied that she had 4. He asked what she would do if there were 5 wounded. She looked at him and replied that then she would have to make a choice. She said this calmly and without fear, and Ray understood why her name had ended up on the plaque. People like that don't run away. He told her one thing. He said that on the way out, she had to stay within 3 steps of him and no further. She asked why. He replied that it was because he didn't have a single healing charge left and he didn't want to die far from a healer. She laughed and agreed. She didn't realize he wasn't joking. The journey out took 3 days. Day 1. The guards led the group to the foot of the ridge and set up camp at the entrance to the hold rift. The rift was small and old, and it was home to stonehounds and ash rats, so it was considered safe. Dorian Cress walked ahead, incinerating the hounds with a single flap of his wing, never once looking back. By evening, he had collected 16 cores and ordered the scribe to mark him as the first. Ray carried 2 bundles and said nothing. Day 2. The group ventured deeper into the second tier. Dorian took the 4 best men and headed down the right passage where the cores were richer. He left Ray and East along with 2 weaker men and their escort, saying that the left passage was enough for the support crew. The escort was Garland Osh, a veteran of the city guard. He was nearing 50 and had lost 2 fingers in the chasms, along with all respect for the academy students. He said he would go first and that if anyone fell behind, he wouldn't come back for them. Day 3. The left branch led them in the wrong direction. It led them to an old gully that wasn't on the map because it had opened up after the spring rains. A chill and the smell of wet stone wafted from the gully. Garland Osh stopped the group and ordered them to turn back. He didn't make it in time. Something emerged from the gully that shouldn't have been there in that small fissure. An ash-colored dog the size of a wagon with a black scab on its spine. A feral creature from the second tier that had wandered down the fissure. Garland Osh struck it in the neck with his halberd, but the halberd bounced off. He shouted for them to run. The creature swept him aside and he flew into the wall and slumped down. It grabbed the first of the weak ones across the torso and shook him. The boy's name was Kel Vert. Ista Verlin rushed toward him, right under its paw. She didn't back down a single step. She placed her palms on his chest and summoned healing, and her branch blossomed green. Ray saw that web from above, fine, precise, with 10 knots. He saw how the stream entered it wide and emerged from the 10th knot as thin as a thread, and he saw the wound beneath her palms. The thread didn't cover that wound. It wouldn't have covered even half of it. Kelberth stopped breathing beneath her hands. Ista struck his chest with her palm and called for healing again and again, expending charge after charge. Second, third, fourth. Nothing. The creature turned to make a second run. Ray took 2 steps and stood between them, summoned Strike, and poured everything he had into it. The earth of the gully rose up like a wall. The creature broke through that wall but lost its momentum and became stuck chest-deep in the rock. A blood vessel burst in Ray's right eye, and the world tilted to one side. He didn't strike a second time. He turned and fell to his knees next to Ista and did what he'd forbidden himself to do. He took her wrists in his hands, skin to skin. He told her it was going to hurt and that she mustn't remove her hands from the boy's chest, no matter what she felt. He said that if she moved her hands, they would both burn. She looked at him once and didn't move her hands. He entered her pattern through touch. From the inside, she wasn't the same as she appeared from the outside. She was warm and alive and very tight. He found the 10th knot right at the root, the thickest one. He didn't have to search for the seam for long. He didn't have much time. He slipped his will under the seam and yanked. The knot came apart. Then he took the 9th, then the 8th, then the seventh. Each subsequent one came easier because the current behind them was already gathering speed and tearing the seam from the inside. On the fifth, Ista screamed. Ray held her wrists and wouldn't let go. On the fourth, the gully grew bright. On the third, the light turned white. On the second, Ray could no longer see. He removed the first one blindly. A branch of the healing branch spread across the entire gully. It wasn't green, it was white and gold, extending into the cracks in the ceiling and down into the stone. The thin thread became a river. The river flowed into Kelvert's chest. The boy arched his back and drew in air with a sound like water rushing into a drain. His wound closed. It didn't just close. It closed completely, leaving no scar on the skin. And the river did not stop there. It continued on its own along the gully. It found Garland Osh by the wall and got him back on his feet in 4 heartbeats, setting his 3 broken ribs back into place. It found 2 weak ones and healed the scrapes no one had noticed. It reached the far wall where grass had sprouted on the rock in a small crevice where nothing had grown for 200 years. Then the light went out. Ista Verlin fell to all fours and vomited. Ray lay on his side and didn't move. Blood was streaming from both his eyes, and all he could see was a gray blur. The creature was still perched on the rock, howling, and Garland Osh stood up and finished it off with 2 blows of his halberd to the eye socket. Then he walked over to them. He didn't ask what it had been. He crouched over Kelvert, tore open his shirt, and began searching for the wound with his fingers. He searched for a long time. He knew where to look. He'd been pulling people out of the rifts for 30 years and knew what a chest looked like after being seized by a maw. He ran his palm over the unmarked skin and found nothing. He sat down on a rock and rested his hands on his knees. Then he said aloud into the void that in 30 years he had seen 4 resurrections, and all 4 had been lies. He said that the boy's sternum had been torn open, that he himself had considered him dead, and that neither archmages nor saints heal the dead. He looked at Ista Verlin and asked what her rank was. She replied, D. Garland Osh laughed once, briefly, and it was a sinister laugh. He hoisted Kelvert onto his shoulder and ordered them to leave. They walked back in silence. Ray walked holding onto Ista's shoulder, because until evening he saw nothing but gray. She led him and remained silent for 2 hours. Then she spoke. She said she had felt him enter. She said it was like having a corset unlaced from the other side. She said that her body felt empty now and that she couldn't feel her branch at all. Ray replied that it would pass and that the knots would return on their own in a day because he'd removed them from a living being, not from his own. He said this and realized he'd said too much. Ista Verlin stopped. She said she hadn't asked him about any knots. He remained silent. Then she said a third thing, and at that, Ray let go of her shoulder. She said that her father had been a scribe at the Helmvar archives. She said that for 12 years he had been transcribing lines of skills, and that one day he came home and told her mother that in every line there were 10 places where the text was bent inward. She said that 9 days after that, they came for him at night and took him away, and that the academy sent them a transfer notice to the capital's archives. She said the notice was unsigned. She said she was 7 years old at the time, and that she had waited for him for 4 years. Then she looked straight at Ray with her reddened eyes and said one last thing. She said she had seen the man who took her father away yesterday, on the parade ground. He was standing on a platform next to the drill instructor and holding a magazine in his hands. Ray asked her what else the man was holding besides the magazine. She replied, gloves. He asked if the man had taken them off. She said no, and that she remembered it because it was hot. He didn't ask any more questions. They reached the camp by nightfall. Garland Osh handed Kel Vert over to the guards and wrote in the log that the boy had suffered a bruise. He wrote this in front of Ray and looked at him over the top of the sheet, and Ray realized that the veteran had made a choice in someone's favor, and that this choice was not in favor of the truth, but in favor of the boy. Dorian Kress returned from the right flank with 29 cannonballs and was angry because the scribe had recorded the destruction of a second-tier creature in the group's report and credited it to his escort rather than to him. The return trip took a day. Ray rode in the rear wagon on top of the bales, gazing at the sky and piecing together in his mind everything he now knew. Father Ishta Verlin had seen the same thing he had. Father Ishta Verlin was taken away at night 9 days later. That meant it had been dangerous to look even before that. So it wasn't God who set the traps. That meant people were guarding them. He spent the next 20 days growing. The first cut. He stopped touching his own grid and began collecting others. He attended the morning forms and the evening sparring sessions and sat so that he could see their hands. In 20 days, he read 109 different markings. Second phase. He discovered that others' knots regrow within a day after being removed, and that each subsequent time they are tied, they become weaker. He tested this on Ist 3 times, and on the 3rd try, he brought her healing to the 8th level in 9 heartbeats instead of 2 minutes. Third cut. He found the limit of his own body. It took him 6 nights to remove the 3rd knot on his own strike. On the 7th night, he removed it and lost consciousness in the laundry room, where he lay until morning and woke up with a bitten-through lip. An 8-fold flow. An F-rank body. It couldn't take any more. Fourth cut. He reached a conclusion worth all the others. His own strength was his body's limit. Another strength had no such limit. He was no warrior. He was a valve on someone else's pipe. The 21st day began when Ista Verlin came to the infirmary and found the SEAL master Audric Payne there. The academy had sent him following a complaint from the city guard. Garland Osh wrote a report. Not about the boy, about the grass. He wrote that grass had grown on a dead rock in the hold fault, that this was a sign of a tier shift, and that the commission should take a look. Audric Payne was the Empire's finest surveyor of his generation, and had arrived with 4 instruments. He took a flow sample from Isti. The instrument showed a D-rank reading. He took a second sample, D-rank. He drove to the rift and took a sample from the grass. The instrument showed a residual trace of S-rank. He returned and took a third sample from Ista, rank D. He lined up all 4 devices and cross-checked them against one another, and all 4 agreed. He stayed in the infirmary until dark and didn't say a word to anyone. Then he packed his box and left without waiting for dinner. 2 days later, he sent a letter to the academy stating that his devices were in working order, that he was absolving himself of responsibility for the measurement, and requesting that he not be involved in Helmvar's affairs in the future. Another day later, Ray was summoned to see the rector. Anselm Crowd's office was located in the tower and smelled of wax and old wood. The rector was heavy-set and slow-moving, and he spoke softly. Ray knew that he spoke softly to those he had already written off. 4 items lay on the table in front of him. Garland Osh's report, a letter from Audric Payne, Weran Toll's measuring rod, and the ceremony log, open to the last page. The rector asked no questions. He began immediately with his answer. He said that Helmvar Academy had existed for 400 years and was sustained not by the strength of its students, but by the predictability of its graduates. He said that the crown pays for predictability. He said that a bearer who registers a 0 on the measurement and leaves behind an S-rank trace is not predictable, and that there had been 3 such bearers in the Academy's history, and all 3 met the same fate. He did not say how. He said he was offering a deal. Ray asked what kind of deal. Anselm Crow replied that the Academy would remove him from the general registry. He said that Ray Olvin's name would be removed from the reserve lists, the records, and the Crown's reports. He said that in return, Ray would receive a private training hall without a measuring crystal, full access to the lower scroll vault, a personal mentor from among the senior masters, and a standard of living befitting an heir to a noble house. He said that in exchange, Ray would not use his class in front of witnesses, would not leave the academy until graduation, and would not give measurements to anyone but him personally. He said this was not a punishment. He said it was protection. And he was sincere. That was the worst part. Ray stood before his desk and listened, and inside him everything became very calm and very cold. Because he'd heard those words before. Not now. Not this time. Back then, he was 18 and had spent 2 years in the reserves without a single assignment, and they'd summoned him to this very tower and told him that the academy valued the quiet ones. They told him he was being transferred to a closed list for special assignment. He'd been happy then. He was a boy who had spent 9 years copying other people's lines for a pittance, and for the first time, he was told he was valued. The closed list was sent to the wall 2 years later, in its entirety. 80 people. They were positioned in the second row at the eastern bastion, and the order was to stand. They couldn't hold the wall. None of the 80 made it back. Ray looked at Rector Anselm Crow and remembered how long he'd lain there under the rubble, how slowly time passed, and how no one ever came. And he remembered one more thing. He remembered that on that day, standing among the crown officers on the bastion, was a man in gloves, holding a logbook and crossing out names as they died. Ray agreed. He said he accepted the terms. He said he was asking for only one addition. He asked to be allowed to bring one assistant from the infirmary into the restricted hall to monitor his condition. Anselm Crowd looked at him and saw a 16-year-old boy haggling for a nurse. He agreed and wrote Isti Verlin's name on the access list, and his face looked satisfied. He figured he'd gotten a good deal. Ray left the tower, went down the stairs, stopped on the lower landing, and stood there just long enough to clench his jaw. Now he had 2 years. Not because he wanted to, because back then the closed list had lasted 2 years and then disappeared. So the clock was ticking. That meant he had exactly as much time as he needed to become someone who couldn't be relegated to the second tier. He returned to the reserve wing and began packing his things to move to the new wing, and at that moment, a bell rang in the courtyard. Not a training bell, the guest bell. Ray walked over to the window. A procession was entering the academy gates. 8 horsemen in black with silver sashes. Between them rode a carriage with the crown's coat of arms on the door. Behind the carriage came a covered wagon with bars on the window. Ray had seen such wagons only once in his life, and they were never used to transport people who could walk on their own. There was a flurry of activity in the courtyard. Halden Werk ran out without his cloak. Rector Anselm Crowd appeared on the porch, and even from where he stood, Ray could see him pause for a second and glance back at the tower. The carriage came to a stop. A middle-aged man stepped out, wearing a traveling cloak with the silver sash of a crown inspector. He took off his traveling gloves and put on a clean pair. Halden Werk bowed to him and announced his name loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. He addressed him as Lord Inspector Cassius Dern, and Ray pressed his forehead against the window frame because his legs had given way. Cassius Dern came to Helmvar once every 4 years, always in the fall, always after graduation, always with a confidential list. There were 9 months until fall. Ray pulled his forehead away from the window frame and watched until the end. They didn't unload the covered wagon in front of everyone. 8 horsemen in black turned their horses around and formed a ring around it. 2 servants carried a screen out of the service wing and positioned it so the courtyard couldn't see the door. Ray counted. 19 seconds passed from the time the wagon stopped until the screen was in place. That's how people who've done this many times work. Beneath the lower edge of the screen, he could see legs. There were 3 of them. The one in the middle was staggering and was being supported by the arms. He had iron shackles on his ankles, and the chain between them was short, about 2 palms long. They led him into the old treasury tower, which had stood empty for 9 years. The door was closed. A lock was hung on the door, and a guard was posted there. Cassius Dern hadn't once looked back at the cart during all that time. He was talking to the rector, and his face was friendly. Ray remembered that too. That evening, he was transferred. The new wing stood behind the library courtyard and was called the Quiet Wing. 4 people lived on the entire floor. The room was 3 times larger than his previous one. The bed was new. On the table stood a tray with meat and white bread, and Ray stared at that tray longer than he did at the bed. For 9 years, he'd eaten from the communal pot and knew the value of white bread. Beyond that wall lay the comforts of an heir to a noble house. Beyond that wall lay a name struck from the 4 registers. He ate everything, lay down, and didn't fall asleep until morning. He was assigned a mentor the next day. Senior Master Gwyn Ortis was tall and lean and carried himself with the straight back of a man who had served 15 years on the border. Rank A, class heavy palm. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and he made no attempt to hide it. He entered the locked hall, surveyed it, and said that the hall was nice, that there was no crystal in it, and that he had been ordered to teach the reserve boy the forms and make sure the boy didn't overexert himself. He said he understood this job to be one of supervision and that he wouldn't pretend otherwise. Ray replied that he appreciated his candor. Gwyn Ortis ordered him to assume a stance and hold it. He held it for half an hour. The master adjusted his elbow and said his stance was poor. On the second day, he said the stance was passable. He said nothing else for 3 days. He sat by the wall, watching, and once an hour wrote a single line in his notebook. Ray made no attempt to please him. He was waiting for access to the vault. Access was granted on the 4th day. The lower scroll vault lay beneath the library courtyard, 2 levels deep, and was accessed by a spiral staircase with 109 steps. Down below, it was dry and cold and smelled of wax. The scrolls lay in lead tubes on shelves, and there were 12 rows of shelves. The custodian of the lower vault was Archivist Nolt. He sat behind a desk under a single lamp and didn't look up when Ray came down. He said the boy had been granted access to the 2nd level. He said there were 840 scrolls covering basic and auxiliary skills. He said the boy would never be granted access to the 1st level. Ray walked up to the desk, placed his palms on it, and asked about the sign the old man had made in the gallery. Nolt finally looked up. He looked up at him from below, and his eyes were whitish and very attentive. He said the mark meant a restricted section. He said he'd made it not for the boy, but for himself, because he hadn't seen the gray lines in 14 years and thought he'd never see them again. He said that the gray lines within the seal's circle appear once in a generation, and that the Academy does not write about them in journals, but instead records reserve and 0 reading. He said that such bearers are called readers. Then he stood up, walked along the bookshelf, returned with an empty tube, and began wiping it with a rag that was unnecessary. He spoke without looking up. He said that the measure does not arise on its own. He said that the 10 notches on each line are set by the agency, and that this agency is older than the empire and is called the Agency of the Memory. He said that its work is simple. It keeps people's power at a level where the crown remains stronger than any of its subjects. He said that an A-rank archmage at full power would be worth more than an entire army, and that they would never allow that to happen. He said that readers are found and eliminated not because they are dangerous in and of themselves, but because they know how to show others where the fold is. Ray asked about the scribe Verlin. Nolt stopped wiping the pipe. He said he wouldn't talk about that. He said the boy had received more than anyone had in 40 years, and that if he asked one more question, his access would be revoked tomorrow. He went back behind the counter and buried his face in a sheet of paper. Ray walked deeper between the shelves, and there, for the first time in many days, he unclenched his fists and looked at his palms. The agency. Not a person, not a clan. The agency is older than the empire. He picked up the first tube, shook out the scroll, and unrolled it on the floor under the lamp. And he saw it. On the parchment was a line of skill. The symbols ran from left to right in 4 rows, and any student would have read them as a sequence of forms. Ray wasn't reading the symbols. Above the parchment was a grid, the same living grid as the one over his hand, only this one was stationary, dormant, and on it were 10 knots. He sat on the stone floor, staring at the scroll, and realized he had found the second half of his class. The living vessel had to be touched. The scroll lay there, waiting. The first cut. He spent 4 nights figuring out that the knot on the parchment could not be removed by will alone. It had to be removed with a pen. The kink wasn't in the force, it was in the line itself. In the 3rd row of symbols, there was an extra pair of strokes that turned the flow inward. He isolated that pair and compared it to another scroll, finding it there as well. He checked 9 scrolls in a row, the exact same pair of strokes, the exact same on all 840 of them. Second attempt. He took the base shield scroll, erased that pair with pumice, and wrote in the continuation of the flow with his own hand. The scroll went blank. He had ruined it. He took a second one and worked differently this time. He didn't erase. He added the bypass to the side of the fold, just as they do in the archives, making corrections without touching the original. The scroll trembled, and the markings above it widened. 1 knot was gone. The 3rd cut. Over the course of 12 nights, he removed 4 knots from a single scroll of the basic shield and stopped at the 5th because the parchment began to smolder along the edge. He understood the rule. The medium is limited by the body. The parchment is limited by itself. The thin leather held 4 steps. A good one would have held more. The 4th cut. He took the corrected scroll out of the vault hidden under his shirt, gave it to Iste Verlin, and told her to learn the shield. She learned it that evening because everyone learns the basic skills. The next morning, in a closed hall, he asked Gwyn Ortis to strike her. The master said he wouldn't hit a D-rank healer. Ray said the master could strike with half his strength. Gwyn Ortis looked at him and at the girl, shrugged, and called his class over. An A-rank heavy palm unfolded over his right hand. He struck with half his strength. Ista Verlin raised her palm and cast a basic shield. The blow struck the shield and stopped. It didn't bend it. It didn't budge it. It stopped as if against a wall. The recoil sent Gwyn Ortis 2 steps backward. He remained standing. He lowered his arm and looked at his palm. Then he walked over to the girl and asked her to demonstrate the hand seals she'd used to cast the shield. She demonstrated them. He asked her to show him again, more slowly. She demonstrated them once more. He checked her insignia, Junior Healer, rank D. He walked over to the wall, sat down on a bench, and sat there for quite a while. Then he said that a first-year basic shield could hold a stone in the palm of one's hand. He said that half the power of a heavy palm was equivalent to an overturned cart. He said he'd seen such a blow break the arm of a rank B practitioner along with his shield. He asked who had compiled the scroll. Ray replied that he didn't understand the question. Gwyn Ortis stood up and walked right up to him. He said he'd served on the Eastern Front for 15 years, and that there, scrolls were more precious than bread, and that a man who'd seen 10,000 scrolls could tell a corrected one from a clean one by the way the ink flowed. He said he wouldn't write about this in a notebook. He said he would write there that the boy had held his ground. He said he wasn't doing it for the boy's sake. Then he said one last thing, and his voice changed. He said that on the Eastern Front, over the course of 9 years, he had lost 211 men, and that they all died with weapons that fell short of their target by a third. He asked Ray if he knew what a third was. Ray replied that he did. He replied that it was 70 men. Gwyn Ortis nodded, left the hall, and didn't return until evening. Ray remained standing in the middle of the empty hall, realizing that he had just gained his first ally and, at the same time, his first witness. A witness is someone who can tell the story. He didn't have time to finish that thought. Ista Verlin entered the hall with a sheet of paper in her hand, her face ashen. The sheet was an academic announcement that had been posted in all 4 courtyards an hour ago. Ray read it twice. By order of Lord Crown Inspector Cassius Dern, a full reassessment was to be conducted. Every student, every teacher, every staff member, all 612 people in Helmvar. A measurement of the flow and a measurement of the residual trace. It would begin in 3 days at dawn. Attendance was mandatory for everyone, including reserves and those removed from the general registry. Ray lowered the sheet. He looked at East and realized what she had realized before him, which was why she had come dressed in white. Her knots had regrown over the past day, but each time they were tied more loosely. She was a D-rank healer with a flow that no longer fit her rank. In 3 days, the device would detect it. Ray folded the sheet in 4, held it over the lamp's flame, and kept it there until the corner with the seal had burned away. He told Ista to sit down. He took her wrists and stepped into the marked area. And for the first time, he did the opposite. He didn't untie the knots. He began to tie them. He found the first knot at the base of the flow, channeled his will over the seam, and tightened it. The knot settled. He tied the second and third, and by the fourth, Ista Verlin stopped breathing through her nose and began breathing through her mouth. He tied all 10 and added 3 more on top, ones she'd never had before. The device was supposed to show anything but a D. The device was supposed to show the bottom of rank E. Ista unclenched her fingers, looked at her palms, and called for healing, and a speck of light the size of a fingernail rose above them. She said it was like going deaf in one ear. Ray replied that it would last 8 days. He said he'd return everything after the reassessment. She asked why there were 3 extra knots. He replied that someone searching for clues always compares them to what's expected, and that the expected value should be set lower than her current level, not on par with it. Then the device would argue with the logbook, not with her. The first phase of preparation. He went down to the vault and didn't touch the scrolls at all for 3 nights. He read the calibration logs. He compiled a list of which devices had been in Helmvar over the past 40 years and what errors had been attributed to them. Second phase. He discovered that an S-rank trace on a stone in the hold fault lasted 11 days, and that a trace on a living body lasts longer and settles into the bone. Third phase. He tested this on himself. He summoned Udar to the 3-knot-removed area in a closed hall and asked Gwyn Ortis to carry a training calibration stone past him the next day. The stone grew lighter. He realized he couldn't hide his own body. Fourth phase. He decided not to hide it. He decided to give the inspectors another source of the mark. The reevaluation began at dawn on the 4th day. Everyone was lined up in the courtyards in 4 rows. Tables were set up under awnings. Seated at the tables were Dern's men in black, Merrick Gast wearing gloves, and the master sealmaker who had been summoned from the capital to replace the refusing Audric Payne. The work proceeded quickly. An apprentice would step forward. He would place his hand on the first crystal. Then he would place his hand on the second. A scribe would write down 2 lines. The apprentice would step back. 612 people were processed that day. Ray stood in the reserve line, looking ahead, and at the 3rd hour he saw the very thing for which Dern had arrived in a covered wagon. The second crystal wasn't working. It was cloudy, and nothing changed on it. People placed their hands on it out of habit. The actual measurement was taking place off to the side. At the edge of the canopy, under the awning, a man sat in a chair. He had been brought out of the treasury tower before dawn. He wore a gray robe and had iron shackles on his ankles. His head was bound with a wide strip of cloth over his eyes. Around his neck lay a dull metal collar 2 fingers wide, and from the collar ran 4 thin chains down to his wrists and to the back of the chair. He sat upright. Every time the student approached the table, the man in the chair turned his face toward him. He was blind. He didn't see with his eyes. Ray saw his markings, and his ears began to ring. They were gray, not white, not red, and not green. Gray, just like his own. Only there weren't 10 knots on it. There were over 40, and they didn't follow the grain of the wood but ran across it, hammered in like nails. Someone had spent a very long time, very methodically, depriving this man of every function except one: reading. Every time he turned his face, one of Dern's men would lean in, listen, and write something down on a sheet of paper. Ray realized that this whole reassessment was a charade involving 612 people, all for the sake of the one person they were looking for. And they were searching for him as a blind reader because only a reader can find a reader. He turned his head. Ista Verlin was standing 2 lines away from him in the infirmary queue. She was looking at the chair. She wasn't moving or blinking, and her face had taken on an expression Ray had never seen on her before. He understood everything 2 heartbeats before she took her first step. He stepped out of line. Dern's people weren't looking at him. He cut diagonally across the courtyard, grabbed her by the elbow right at the awning, turned her toward him, and led her aside the way one leads a person who's feeling ill. She didn't struggle. She walked along, repeating that it was him. She kept saying that he was missing 2 fingernails on his left hand, and that he'd lost them even before the archive. Ray led her behind a column in the gallery, pressed her back against the stone, and told her 3 things very quietly and very quickly. He said that if she went there now, a second chair would be placed next to the first one in a minute. He said that the man with the collar could neither speak nor move, and that it was impossible to get him out of the square with the 8 horsemen present. He said that getting him out of the treasury tower at night was possible. Ista Verlin stopped struggling. She said that if he was lying to her now, she would kill him herself. He replied that he wasn't lying. Then he returned to the line and went through the scan. The first crystal read 0. Merrick Gast raised an eyebrow, jotted down the 0, and looked at him over the top of the sheet. In his gaze was the relief of a man whose report had come out right. At that moment, the man in the chair turned his face. He turned it directly toward Ray. He held it that way for 3 heartbeats. Then he lowered it. He said nothing to the scribe who had leaned toward him. Ray stepped away from the table, and his shirt clung to his back. That night, they went to the tower. Gwyn Ortis went with them. In the closed chamber, he said he wasn't asking who was in the tower. He said that 20 years ago he had seen a similar chair on the Eastern Line, and that he had kept quiet then. He said he wouldn't remain silent a second time. The treasury towers stood behind the stables. There was 1 guard at its door and 2 inside. Ray took out the sentry without using force. He approached openly and said he was carrying an order from the assessment chamber, then handed over a folded sheet of paper. And when the sentry lowered his gaze, Gwyn Ortis grabbed him from behind by the nape of the neck with his elbow and held him until he went limp. The two inside were taken on the stairs in the same manner. Martin Verlin was sitting in a chair in the upper room and was awake. He turned his face toward the creak of the door. Ista approached, knelt before him, and took his hand. He didn't recognize her. He traced her fingers with his own, froze, and then said into the void that his daughter had a scar on her thumb from a kitchen knife. She said the scar was still there. He said she had to leave immediately. He said that the collar was called a measuring lock, that the lock was linked to the wearer, that the lock's connection was checked every 6 hours from the chamber, and that there were less than 2 hours left until the next check. He said it couldn't be removed and that 3 people had tried, and all 3 had died along with him. Ray was already at the collar. He could see it from the inside. The lock wasn't made of iron. It was a string. Someone had woven a spell around the man's neck and tied it to the carrier itself so that the flow circled and fed upon itself. 42 knots. Ray read them in a minute and grasped the crux of the matter. The lock wasn't held together by 42 knots. It was held together by 3. The remaining 39 were a decoy for anyone who tried to break them in sequence. Martin Verlin sensed that he was being read. Hooves stopped at the door, and the bell fell silent. Gwyn Ortis slid the bolt into place, propped it with a bench, and said the bolt would hold for half a minute at most. Ray was already looking at his right hand. He said one word to the master. He said the master would have to agree. Gwyn Ortis looked down at him and asked what exactly. Ray replied that he would remove 4 knots from his heavy palm, that it would hurt, and that afterward the master would strike the wall once. Gwyn Ortis asked what would happen to him afterward. Ray answered honestly. He said the knots would grow back within a day, and that an A-rank body could withstand 4 levels but wouldn't survive the 5th. The master held out his hand, palm up, and said he'd been waiting for this conversation ever since the day he saw the girl's shield. Ray took his wrist. The markings of the heavy palm were old and dense, covered in calluses from long years of combat wear. He removed the 10th, the 9th, the 8th, and the 7th. On the 7th, Gwyn Ortis wheezed through clenched teeth and made no further sound. Downstairs, someone had broken down the outer door. The master turned toward the north wall of the tower. He didn't strike the door or the staircase. He struck the solid masonry at the level of the 2nd tier. The treasury wall was 2 cubits thick and had been built 400 years ago. It came out in one solid piece, 3 human heights long, landed on the stable roof, and slid into the darkness along with half the corner. Night air rushed through the breach. Gwyn Ortis lowered his hand and looked at it. His face was wet. He said that for 22 years he had been striking this wall, and that all this time it had been 3/4 shorter. Ray shouted for them to leave. They made their way across the rubble to the stable roof, and from there down into the alley behind the laundry. Martin Verlin walked on his own for the first 30 paces, and then his legs gave out, and Gwyn Ortis hoisted him onto his shoulder. The horsemen were circling the tower, and 2 of them entered the alley. Leading the way was the captain of the escort, a black cloak with a silver sash. Rank A, class Spear of Judgment. He didn't shout or call out to his men. He summoned his class, and a shaft of white light gathered over his shoulder. Gwyn Ortis set Martin Verlin down on the ground and stepped forward. The first exchange lasted 3 heartbeats. The captain struck preemptively, and his spear entered the master's side beneath his ribs and exited through his back. Gwyn Ortis caught the shaft with his left hand, missing 2 fingers, and prevented him from retreating. He took a step forward along the spear and struck with his right. The captain of the Spears of Judgment managed to put up a block, an A-rank block. The heavy palm, with 4 knots removed, struck that block and passed right through it. The captain was hurled across the entire alley and slammed into the laundry room wall. The wall absorbed the impact and crumbled. He did not get up. The second rider turned his horse around and rode back after the others. Gwen Ortis sat down right where he had been standing. The spear of light went out, leaving behind a ragged hole in his side the width of a fist. Ista Verlin fell to her knees beside him and called for healing, and a stub of light the size of a fingernail rose above her palms. She forgot. Ray grabbed her wrists, stepped into the markings, and began to tear apart the knots he himself had tied 4 days earlier. He tore them not one by one, but in bunches at a time, because he had tied them with his own hand and knew every stitch from the inside. He removed 13 in 9 heartbeats. The river rose above the alley. She entered Gwen Ortis and lifted him off the ground, holding him aloft, and Ray saw the intestinal wall fuse back together, 3 ribs snap back into place, and the skin close over them. She walked further down the alley and found Captain Spear of the Verdict by the laundry room wall, and Ray didn't have time to do anything. The river healed him too. He sat down against the wall, began to breathe, and watched them through the dust. His face was blank. They left through the service gate. Gwen Ortis walked on his own, carrying Martin Verlin, and spoke a single sentence as they went. He said that in 19 years of service, he'd never seen a D-rank healer repair a perforated peritoneum. He said it matter-of-factly and didn't return to the subject. They weren't the ones who led them out of the academy. Dorian Kress escorted them out. He was waiting at the service gate with 2 horses, the gate open, and an exit permit signed in his own hand as heir to the house. He said he'd seen everything from the gallery, and that he wasn't going to explain why he'd been standing there at night. He said the Kress family controlled 2 mountain passes, that a caravan was traveling through the northern one today, and that no one would stop the caravan before dawn. Ray asked why. Dorian Kress was silent for a long time. Then he answered. He said that 8 years ago, his father had returned from the Eastern Front missing an arm. He said that back home, his father drank and kept repeating the same thing. He said he'd struck with all his might, but hadn't finished him off. He said that as a boy, he'd thought it was just a drunk man's lie. He said that tonight, he'd seen the treasury wall get knocked into the stables with a single blow, and that now nothing made sense in his head at all. He said he wasn't taking anyone's side and that he simply wanted to know the truth about his father. He said he'd open the gate just this once for that. Ray looked at him and realized that he was facing not an ally, but a debt. Debts are worse than allies. They have to be paid. Martin Verlin and Gwen Ortis were taken by wagon to the northern pass, to the village of Tolvin, where the Kress family operated an old post station. Ista left with her father. Ray stayed behind. He stayed because a fugitive reserve meant a manhunt across 2 counties, whereas a reserve present at the morning roll call was a misunderstanding. He returned to the Silent Corps an hour before dawn, went to bed, got up at 7 for roll call, and was marked present. The morning at the academy was quiet. Nothing was announced about the Treasury Tower. The breach had been sealed 2 days earlier, and they said the old masonry had crumbled. They didn't mention the 8 horsemen either. Cassius Dern hadn't left. He had settled into the guest wing and began walking around the academy on foot and unescorted, greeting the students and memorizing their names. It was worse than a roundup. 4 days later, a letter arrived from Tolvin. It was written in Isti's hand and contained 3 lines. She wrote that her father had begun to get out of bed. She wrote that he hadn't spoken a single word in 4 days, and that last night he had gone out into the courtyard and stood there, listening. She wrote that Master Ortis had carved a walking stick for him, and that his father had taken it. Ray burned the letter, and that evening went to the parade ground, sat down on the bottom step, and stayed there until dark. He thought about the numbers. 211 men of Gwen Ortis. a third short of the quota. 70 men. He thought about Dorian Cress's father, who had beaten him but not finished him off. He thought about the 80 names on the bastion. He stood up and said aloud what he had been keeping in his head until then and had never once told a single person. He told the empty parade ground that he would take the measure from everyone. Not from just one healer. Not just one healer. Everyone. He said that to do this, he needed to prove that the measure is lifted from the line, not from the individual. He said that if he proved this, then the power would flow through the scrolls on its own, and it would be impossible to stop it. He said this quietly and evenly, as if reading a verdict. Then he went to the lower vault. He descended the 109 steps and saw that the lamp above the desk was lit and that there was no one behind the desk. And he saw a second thing. The 12th row of shelves was closed off. Not locked. It was sealed with a lead shutter extending from floor to ceiling, and across the shutter was a fresh seal bearing the imprint of a set of scales and the signature of Cassius Dern. The 12th row was the first level of access, the one to which no one was granted access. Ray walked over to the seal and read the text beneath it. It stated that the row was sealed until the arrival of the Commission of the Department of Measurement. The arrival date was listed below. The commission was scheduled to depart from the capital in 6 days. He didn't break the seal. He went upstairs and went to sleep. In the morning, he reported for roll call, and after roll call, he went to the closed hall and worked on the forms there for 4 hours straight at the master's empty workbench. He counted the days. 6 days wasn't enough time to break in, but it was enough for something else. First cut. He recalled that the 12th row had been sealed the day before yesterday, and that before that it had stood open for 109 years, and that over those 109 years, scrolls had been removed from it for correspondence. He went to the upper archive, took the issuance log, and copied from it all the items removed from the 12th row over the past 40 years. There were 184 of them. Second segment. Of the 184 items removed, 163 were returned the same day. 21 remained on loan for more than a day. Of those 21, 19 were returned within a month. 2 never returned, and next to them was a note indicating they had been written off as worn out. The dates of write-off were listed nearby. Both had been written off in the same month 19 years ago. The very same month that the scribe Martin Verlin was taken away. Third section. He found barrels of discarded parchment in the library's basement. The worn scrolls weren't burned. They were soaked and used as backing for book bindings. He went through 4 barrels over 3 nights and found, in the second barrel, a parchment that hadn't been soaked. Someone had placed it there intact and covered it with scraps on top. The fourth fragment. He unfolded it under the lamp, read the markings, and sat down on the floor. It wasn't a line of skill. It was a line of measure. That very pair of strokes that wraps around the flow. Separately, on its own, with a complete description of how it's superimposed onto someone else's line, how it holds, and what causes it to break. 19 years ago, someone had taken the source code for the measure from the first row, never returned it, and hidden it in a barrel of wet paper before they came for him. Ray sat with that parchment until morning. He had obtained what he'd been planning to break the seal for, and he'd gotten it in 3 nights without breaking in. He hid the parchment under a plank in a locked hall, and 2 days later, none of it mattered anymore, because the agency arrived ahead of its commission, and they hadn't come for him. Cassius Dern convened the Academy in the Hall of Seals on the 4th day. All 612 were present. He ascended the dais to the black circle, spoke without raising his voice, and spoke slowly. He said that the crown thanked Helmvar for his service. He said that, following a reassessment, discrepancies had been discovered at the academy between the reported declared ranks and residual traces. He said that these discrepancies were not isolated incidents and that the students were not to blame. He said that the blame lay with the administration and that Rector Anselm Crowd had been relieved of his duties effective today and would remain at the academy in the rank of honorary mentor. He said that until a new rector is appointed, the Department of Measurement, represented by him, will assume administrative control. He said that the curriculum will not change. He said that only one thing will change. Starting tomorrow, measurement seals will be placed in every courtyard, every hall, and every corridor. He explained that this is as simple and straightforward as explaining it to children. He said that the seal does not strike, burn, or punish anyone. The seal records. It records any flow that passes near it, noting the time, magnitude, and direction. He said that the academy is becoming transparent and that this is a safeguard for the students against accidents. The hall listened quietly. The students were indifferent. Ray stood in the third row and felt he was losing something. He was losing the night. He was losing the laundry room, the barnyard, and the closed hall. He was losing the ability to work at all because removing a knot produced a surge, and surges were now recorded everywhere. Then it got worse. Dern turned to the second page and read an excerpt from the Empire's statutory code that had never before been read aloud in Helmvar. He read that a bearer of a class not listed in the general registry is under the care of the crown from the moment of awakening. He read that this care includes support, education, and assignment. He read that assignment is carried out by the Department of Care as needed, without the bearer's consent and without the right to appeal. He lowered the sheet and said he understood that these were just dry words. He said he would put them into practice. He said that there was currently one such bearer in Helmvar. He said that he had been struck from the registers 2 months ago by a decision of the former administration, and that this decision was unlawful and had been overturned. He gave a name. He named Ray Olvin. 612 people turned their heads. Ray stood motionless. He looked at Dern, and Dern looked straight at him. There was neither threat nor triumph in his face. It was benevolent. He said that the carrier, Olvin, would remain at the academy on the same terms as everyone else. He said that his reserve allowance and reserve quarters would be restored to him, and that the closed hall would be transferred to the combat corps. He said that guardianship would not begin immediately, but only upon reaching the age of majority, and that until that day, the carrier faced no threat. He said he asked everyone to treat him humanely. And in doing so, he achieved what no roundup could have. He did not lock Ray up. He declared him publicly and returned him to his paper cage, and he did so legally, gently, and in full view of everyone. After that, no escape would work anymore. A fugitive from the reserve meant a manhunt across 2 counties. A fugitive carrier under the Crown's care meant a manhunt across the Empire and criminal charges for anyone who gave him bread. Dorian Kress stood by the wall, staring at the floor. His gate had closed forever at that very moment, and he understood it. That evening, Ray carried his belongings back to the 4th tier and slipped the parchment containing the source code for the measure into his bosom along with them. A day later, seals were affixed to all the courtyards. There were 48 of them. He walked around the academy in 2 hours, marked them on the map, and realized that there were no unsealed spots left anywhere except the lower vault. The storage area had been left untouched because the lead blocked the recording. He went down there on the 2nd night. Nolta was gone again, and the lamp was still burning. He sat down between the shelves, unfolded the source code, and began to work. The work was quiet. It produced no emissions. He didn't remove the nodes. He was learning how to apply them. He took a blank scroll of the basic thrust and applied the measure to it with his hand, following the instructions. He got it right on the second try. He looked at what he had done and realized that he now knew how to do both sides. And that was when he deduced the rule that turned everything upside down. The measure was applied to a line only once when it was created. All 840 scrolls in the repository were copies. The copies were made from the originals. The originals lay in the front row. If the measure were removed from the original, every new copy would come from it already clean. Not just one scroll, all the scrolls of the Empire from then on. He needed the 12th row. He raised his head and looked down the aisle at the lead shutter bearing the seal, and at that moment realized he wasn't alone in the vault. Selena Morvain was standing by the counter, Archmage of the Branches, rank A, top student of her class. She was holding a lamp and looking at the parchment spread out around him. She said she'd been coming here for 4 months under special permission and that she'd come down today at the 3rd hour. She said she'd seen everything. Ray stood up. She set down the lamp, walked over, and said she wouldn't call anyone else and that she had just one question. She raised her palm and summoned her class, and a tree of light with 12 branches rose above her palm. It was so beautiful it hurt the eyes. She asked how many nodes she had. Ray replied that she had 10. She asked what would happen if she removed them all. He replied that she would become 1,000 times stronger, that her body could withstand up to 6 levels of power, and that the 7th would kill her. Selena Morvain extinguished the tree. She stood, staring at the floor, her expression changing slowly. She said she had been at the top of her class for 4 years. She said she woke up before the bell rang every day, and that in 4 years she had missed 9 days, all 9 due to illness. She said that yesterday her father had received a letter stating that the Morvain family was nominating her for the fall royal selection, and that she had been proud of that letter for a full day. She said that now she understood that for all 4 years in a row, she had been banging her head against the ceiling that had been set for her before she was even born. She looked up, and her eyes were dry and angry. She said she wanted 6 steps. Ray replied that he wouldn't do it. She asked why. He replied that the seals in the courtyards would record her ejection down to the hour, and that she'd end up in a chair with a collar that very same day, and that he wouldn't grant power to someone who didn't understand its value. Selena Morvain listened to this, nodded, and said that in that case she had a counteroffer. She said she had front row access, personal access, signed by Rector Anselm Crowd last year for work on the selection program. She said that Dern's seal on the shutter sealed off the row from entry, not from viewing, and that she could bring one person under her supervision there for 2 hours. She said she'd do it tomorrow and that in return, she didn't want force. She wanted to be present. Ray agreed. He got up from the vault before dawn and went out into the library courtyard, where he saw that the lights were on. Wagons were parked by the west wing. The Department of Measurement Commission had arrived, 2 days ahead of schedule. Boxes were being unloaded from the first wagon. From the second, they carried out a chair with 4 chains and a new collar, and Ray realized they had brought it empty. Ray counted the wagons. There were 5 of them. He stood in the shadow of the library archway until the last crate was unloaded, and left only when they began to extinguish the torches in the courtyard. The chair was carried into the west wing on the 2nd floor, where a 2-man guard was posted. He returned to the holding room, sat down on the cot, and began to think quickly and concisely. The empty chair wasn't brought for Martin Verlin. Martin Verlin was being transported in a finished chair. The empty chair was being brought in to be measured. That meant it had already been cast to fit someone's neck, which meant the decision had been made before this morning, and which meant that the talk of coming of age and guardianship upon reaching it had been mere pleasantries. He hadn't even turned 2 yet. He was just old enough for the commission to finalize the paperwork. He went to see Selina Morvain that same day after the third bell. She was waiting for him in the passageway by the West Gallery. She was calm, and he realized she hadn't slept either. She led him into the lower vault using her access pass, past the reception desk, and this time, Nolt was sitting at his desk. The old man looked up at the two of them, then lowered his eyes back to his paperwork and said nothing. Selina took the key on a chain from around her neck, unlocked the side door in the lead shutter, and gave the access code and the time, and they entered. The first row was short, 11 shelves. On them lay not scrolls, but slabs. The first-level skill lines were written not on parchment, but on beechwood slabs in lead cases, because parchment couldn't handle the full flow. Ray walked along the shelves and realized why this row wasn't open to anyone. These weren't just skills. These were the originals. Each plate was that very first line from which, over 400 years, thousands of copies had been made for the entire empire. He found Basic Shield, Basic Strike, and Basic Healing, and they were on the first shelf simply because they were the oldest. He took the healing plate, removed it from its case, and placed it on the floor under the lamp. The markings above the beechwood appeared immediately, bright and deep, not static like on scrolls, but alive. And there were 10 nodes on it. Ray took out a quill, an inkwell, and the source template and set to work. Selina Morvain sat on the floor 3 paces away, watching intently. She didn't say a word for 2 hours. He removed 3 knots from the original healing plate. He didn't have time for more. The beechwood could have held all 10. There wasn't enough time. He returned the plate to its case, put it back in its place, and they left a minute before the end of their access period. In the passageway, Selina stopped and said one thing. She said that from now on, every copy made from this plate would be 8 times more powerful. She said that the copies were being sent to 74 infirmaries across the empire. She said she didn't understand why her hands were shaking, because she hadn't even cast a spell. Ray replied that her hands were shaking because she was the first person in 400 years to witness the process. The next 9 days were the calmest of that entire period, and he would later revisit those memories many times. First segment. He went to the front row 4 times with Selina's permission and removed 3 nodes from the strike, 4 from the shield, and 2 from the thrust. Second cut. He stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a time and began eating standing up. He lost so much weight that his shirt hung loosely, and during roll call, Merrick Gast looked at him and jotted something down on his sheet. Third cut. He began keeping track. He wrote with charcoal on the underside of the shutter how many infirmaries would receive the corrected healing and how many garrisons would receive the corrected shield, and the numbers grew, and he looked at them before going to sleep instead of counting his enemies. Fourth segment. On the 8th day, a second letter arrived from Tolvin. Ista wrote that her father had started speaking. She wrote that he spoke little and to the point, and that he had asked about the boy who had picked the lock. She wrote that Master Ortis was teaching her father to walk around the courtyard without a cane, and that they were making progress. In the last line, she wrote that she missed him. Ray didn't burn that letter. He placed it under a board in the reserve room next to the source of the measure, and that was the first careless mistake he'd made in 2 months. On the 10th day, he went down to the vault at 3 o'clock in the morning and found neither the lamp nor Nolt. The shutters of the first row stood wide open. A light was on inside. He went in. There were people in the front row. Cassius Dern stood by the first shelf in a travel coat and without gloves. Next to him stood 2 members of the commission with a box. On the floor beneath the lamp lay 3 removed plates: treatment, shield, impact. And standing above them was Nolt, holding the 4th plate in his hands, explaining something quietly and pointing at the markings. His pale eyes were completely calm. He spoke quickly and confidently, the way a man does when he's doing his job well. Ray stopped in the passageway. Nolt looked up, saw him, and didn't flinch. He placed the plate back in its case, turned his whole body toward him, and began to speak without offering an apology. He said he had served the agency for 41 years. He said that the position of custodian of the lower vault was not that of a bookkeeper, but of a custodian of records, and that it was the same position, just described differently on various documents. He said that over the course of 41 years, 4 readers had passed through his hands. He named them in order. The first was found at 16, the second at 19. The third was the scribe Martin Verlin, whom he identified from 3 extracts and turned in within 9 days. The fourth was Ray. He said that the mark on the gallery on the day of the ceremony was not a warning. He said it was a marker. He said he always placed it so the agency would know whom to lead. He said that after that, everything happens on its own. The reader is granted access. The reader is given free rein. In 2 months, a reader finds what the agency would have spent 10 years looking for and leads them straight to where they need to go. He said the boy worked better than all 4 of them combined, and that the source material had lain in the barrel for 19 years without a single agent finding it. He said he was grateful. He said it without sarcasm. He said it the way a master speaks of a fine tool. Cassius Dern had been silent the whole time. Then he walked over and crouched down over the healing plate and began to look at it. And Ray realized that the inspector could see the markings too. Not the same way as the reader, through the device. One of the commission members handed him a measuring frame, and Dern positioned it over the plate, looked through it, lowered it, and looked again. He did this 3 times. Then he lifted the frame and positioned it over the second shelf for comparison, before returning to the plate. He stood up, handed back the frame, and said in an even voice that 3 steps had been removed from the original healing. He said that the original healing had been written in the year 412, and that over the course of 400 years, 11 master seal makers had worked on it, all 11 working in commissions of 8 people each, and not a single one had altered a single stroke. He turned to Ray and looked at him intently and without any kindness, saying that he didn't understand how this could have been done with a pen and 1 hand. He said he would write a separate report on this and that he wouldn't be the one to read it. After that, everything proceeded quickly and routinely. The commission documented the 3 plates. They did not attempt to repair them on the spot. They were placed in lead cases, sealed, and put into a crate to be sent to the capital. Dern said that the standard would be restored only in the main collection, and that it would take a month. That meant the copies would come out clean for a month. That meant the 74 infirmaries would get what was theirs after all. Ray clung to that thought as they led him upstairs. They searched the reserve room in his presence. They found everything. The original measure from under the plank, the diagram of the 48 seals, and the charcoal abacus on the underside of the shutter. A letter from Tolvin with the return address of the Kress family's postal station. Dern read the letter, folded it, put it in his pocket, and said that a detachment would set out in the morning to pursue the fugitive courier Verlin and Master Ortis. Then he said he would now deal with Ray himself. They took him to the 2nd floor of the West Wing. An armchair stood in the middle of the room. It was empty and new, with shavings still lying on the armrests. He was seated, and his wrists were restrained. One of the commission members opened a drawer and took out a collar, and Ray saw it from the inside. 42 knots. The same blueprint. He'd been expecting this and was ready for it. He knew he'd find 3 load-bearing points in a minute. But the man from the commission didn't put the collar on him. Instead, he set it on the table, took out a measuring frame, placed it against Ray's chest, and turned the screw. Ray felt a foreign line entering him, not outward, inside. It followed his own grid, lay on top of it, and began to weave. He jerked back but couldn't move his hand, and then he tried to enter that line and read it, and realized a second thing. He could only read what he saw, but he had never seen what was being knitted within him. He couldn't read his own grid. He could only feel. He felt the first knot being tied, the one he'd been unraveling for 6 nights, then the second, then the third, then the fourth and the fifth and the fifth third, then the fourth and the fifth and the sixth, and they all lay on top of one another and tightened, leaving him with nothing. Cassius Dern stood in the doorway and watched. He said they would put the collar on him in the capital because there was no craftsman here who knew how to fit it. He said there were 8 days until departure. He said that during those 8 days, the carrier, Olvin, would be given food and sleep, and that no one would beat him. He said this without any cruelty, then left, and the door was locked from the outside. Ray remained seated in the chair in the empty room. He summoned the blow. A faint, curved grid, as thin as a spiderweb after the rain, formed over his fist. There were 10 knots in it. And then, for the first time in 2 months, he stopped putting on a brave face, lowered his head, and sat that way until dawn. Chapter Summary. Selena Morvain leads Ray to the sealed front row, where he removes the knots directly from the 400-year-old originals of the Healing Shield and the Strike, so that all future copies for the 74 infirmaries and garrisons will be reinforced. Archivist Nolt turns out to be a servant of the Department of Measurement for 41 years and admits that the symbol on the gallery was a marker, that he had betrayed both Martin and Verlin, and that the reader was given free rein specifically so he could find what the department would have spent 10 years searching for. The originals are transported to the capital for restoration. Ray is seated in a chair, and all the knots are tied back in place using a measuring frame. In the morning, a detachment sets out for Tolvin to pursue Verlin and Orta. A detachment sets out for Tolvin, and there are 8 days left before Ray is sent to the capital. Dawn broke gray, and shavings on the armrests became visible in the room. Ray raised his head and began counting again. 8 days. The chair stood in the middle of an empty room, and his wrists were held fast by leather straps with brass buckles, and the buckles were new. Twice a day, a guard from the commission would come, unbuckle his left wrist, place a bowl on the armrest, and stand by the door while Ray ate. They didn't beat him. They didn't ask him anything. They kept him the way a box is kept before shipping. On the second day, he checked everything he had left. The guard lit a lantern by the door so he wouldn't have to sit in the dark, and Ray looked at the mark. There was a mark. It hovered above the copper bowl, dim and rippled like a reflection in murky water. He saw it. He reached for it with his will, but didn't quite make it. Between him and the grid stood his own. The stranger's line lay on top of him and blocked not the flow, but the exit. He could look. He couldn't reach out. He tried through touch. He asked the guard to give him some water, and when the guard handed him the mug, Ray held his fingers on the guard's wrist for 2 heartbeats. The guard's pattern opened up before him in its entirety, with 10 knots and the first one at the stream's exit. He directed his will beneath the seam, and nothing happened. He tried again and felt only a dull, cotton-like numbness where the seam had been. The guard took the mug and left. Ray tilted his head back against the chair's backrest and allowed himself just enough leeway to unclench his jaw. Then he began to think. He went over everything he knew and arrived at the rule he deduced 2 months ago in the lower vault on the 4th night. A knot on parchment cannot be undone by will alone. It is undone with a pen. The kink was not in the force, it was in the line itself. Ray sat in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and realized that all this time he had been mistaken about himself. He had thought that his strength lay in his eyes and his will. The will was gone. His eyes remained. And so did 9 years spent for a pittance in the archives, where he had transcribed others' lines, symbol by symbol, and where he had been taught a single craft that required neither rank nor talent. All he needed was a quill, ink, and blank parchment. Selina Morvain arrived on the third day with a request for access to the storage medium to verify the academic records, and the guard let her in because the paper was signed by Halden Verk. She sat on a stool by the wall and spoke loudly and monotonously about the records. Beneath the records lay 3 blank scrolls, a quill, and a vial. Ray told her 4 things very quickly. He said he remembered the source text by heart down to the last stroke because he'd copied it for 9 nights in a row. He said a blank line could be written from scratch and that no stream was needed for that. He said he would write with his left hand because his right hand was unfastened only at mealtimes. He said she would have to carry the finished work out every day in her skirt. First attempt. He wrote for 6 days. He worked 2 hours in the morning and 3 in the evening, holding the scroll on his knee and propping it up with his chin. He ruined the first scroll on the 3rd row of symbols, the second on the 4th, and the 3rd one turned out right. Second cut. He wasn't writing copies of academic skills, he was writing clean lines. Basic healing without measure, basic shield without measure, basic thrust. He wrote them from memory, and in each one he bypassed the spot where, for 400 years in a row, a pair of strokes had been placed to divert the flow inward. Third attempt. He realized that the thin student parchment could withstand 4 levels and smoldered at the 5th, and that he needed to ask for better quality leather. Selina brought calfskin from the bookbinding shop. She had 8 pieces. Fourth cut. By the 6th day, 11 blank lines had disappeared beneath her cloak. She never once asked for whom. On the 5th day, Merrick Gast arrived. He came with a measuring crystal on a stand, wearing gloves, and ordered the guard to leave. He said he was required to verify the condition of the medium before handing it over to the commission. He held the crystal up to Ray's chest. The crystal remained transparent. He repeated the measurement. Transparent. He wiped the facet with a handkerchief and took a 3rd measurement, and Ray watched his hands and saw that the handkerchief wasn't necessary, and hadn't been necessary the first time either. Merrick Gast straightened up and wrote a 0 on the sheet. Then he didn't leave. He stood over the chair, holding the sheet, and didn't move. He said that 19 years ago he'd seen a 0 reading once and had recorded it then just as calmly as he did today. He said that the subject in question was 32 years old, a scribe, and had been taken away 9 days after the reading. He said there were 2 signatures on that sheet, and the second one was his. He said that he was 26 years old at the time, and that they had explained to him that this was a registration, not an arrest. Ray replied with a single sentence. He said that the man who had been taken away had returned, and that 2 fingernails were missing from his left hand. Merrick Gast was silent for a long time. Then he did something strange. He took off the glove from his right hand and looked at his palm as if it were someone else's. He said that 8 years after that document, he was transferred to military registration on the Eastern Front, and that there he kept a log of troop deployments to the bastions, and that there were 4 logs, and he remembers all 4 by heart. He said that the names in them weren't written in ink, but with a stylus so they could be erased. He said he erased them himself. He put his glove back on, took his crystal, walked to the door, stopped at the door, and said one last thing. He said he wouldn't help. He said it was already too late. He said he just wanted to say it out loud once, to someone who would understand. He left. Ray remained in his chair and realized that the puzzle he'd been unable to solve for 2 months had now come together completely. The man in gloves who had taken the scribe away. The man in gloves who, with 3 gestures, brought his own ceremony to a close. The man in gloves who stood on the bastion and extinguished the names as they faded on their own. The same man all along. And this man had just confessed, yet he would still do nothing. The 6th day was spent in Tolvin. The detachment set out after Martin Verlin and Gwyn Ortis the following morning after the search, and it was a 2-day journey to the northern pass. Selena Morvain went to see Dorian Cress that evening and returned empty-handed. She said he listened to her and replied that his gate had closed and that the House of Cress would not meddle in the Crown's affairs a second time. She said he didn't look at her while he was speaking. Ray told her to go back there one more time and convey 3 messages. He told her to say that he had struck but not finished her off. He told her to say that the shortfall was 3/4 and that this was not drunken nonsense, but a fact. He told her to say that Ray had a clean healing record and that he didn't know if it would restore her hand, and that he was speaking honestly about this right. Selena left. An hour later, the stable gates clanged in the courtyard. Dorian Cress took 4 fresh horses and set off down the northern road into the night, telling no one where he was going. He traveled light and knew the pass from childhood, outpacing the foot patrol by a day's journey. On the 8th day, the patrol returned. Ray heard it through the door by the sound of hooves in the courtyard and the way the servants began rushing about. The guard brought his evening bowl and was talkative because he was angry. He said the post station in Tolvin had been empty for 4 days. He said the stove was cold and that there were fresh shavings and a carved stick lying in the courtyard. He said the squad leader would be investigated. Ray ate and did the math. Dorian had made it. That meant Gwyn Ortis had led the blind man further into the mountains. That meant Ista was with them. That meant he'd gained 8 days. And that meant in the morning they'd take him to the capital and he'd go there empty-handed, with his net tied up and without a single person by his side. He finished eating and the guard took the bowl, secured his left hand, extinguished the lantern signal, and locked the door from the outside. The room went dark. Ray closed his eyes and began counting his heartbeats to fall asleep. He counted to 300 and realized he wasn't alone in the room. He hadn't heard the door open. He heard a brief thud of wood on the stone floor. Once, then twice. The footsteps were cautious and very steady, and the man was walking without looking. You could tell because he didn't slow down when passing the furniture. He walked around the armchair from behind. Ray sat motionless. A dry hand rested on his forehead, turned his head to the side, and held it there. Then the man leaned in and spoke into his ear, very quietly and very evenly, and Ray recognized the voice from the square. Martin Verlin said he'd been walking for 6 days and that he'd been led for 2 days before continuing on his own. He said that his daughter had remained in the mountains and that the master was holding her there by force. He said that he had entered the academy through the service gate because a blind beggar with a cane isn't stopped anywhere. He said that he was standing before the boy who had removed the measuring lock from him, and that in 19 years in the chair, he had read 4,000 media and 11 readers and knows everything there is to know about this work. He said they had until the morning bell. He said that one's own thoughts can never be read, but those of others always can. He said he could see everything on Ray, down to the very last seam. The hand moved away from his forehead, and Ray heard the cane hit the floor. Martin Verlaine walked around the chair, knelt down in front of him, and took his wrists above the leather straps. He said it would hurt, that he mustn't scream, and that there was a man standing outside the door. He said he would give him his sleeve. He rolled up the edge of his sleeve into a tourniquet and placed it between Ray's teeth. Then he began. From the inside, it was unlike anything Ray had ever done to others. He had always entered another's markings from above and seen them in their entirety, like a blueprint under a lamp. Now another's will was entering him, and he could see nothing. He felt it. He felt something slender being threaded into him, and how that slender thing searched blindly, missed its mark, and entered again. Martin Verlaine worked silently and very slowly. He found the first seam after a quarter of an hour. He didn't tear it open. He said through clenched teeth that the frame didn't knit like a hand, and that the frame's knot shouldn't be torn, but unwind it in the same direction it had been twisted. He unwound it for 20 minutes. When the knot came undone, Ray bit right through the sleeve and his eyes rolled back. The second one was easier. The third took longer than the first. By the fourth one, the blind man's hands began to shake, and he stopped and said he needed to rest, then sat down right on the floor next to the chair. And that's when he started talking. He spoke quietly and without pause, and Ray listened to him for an hour, and in that hour, he learned more than he had in 2 months in the vault. Martin Verlaine said that measure does not lie in the lines of skill. He said that it lies with people. He said that the boy had been making copies and originals all this time and had been doing it correctly, but that the benefit of this was less than it seemed. He said that if the measure depended solely on parchment, then a student who had learned a skill from a clean scroll would be able to channel at full power. He asked whether the D-rank healer had been able to channel at full power after learning the corrected shield. Ray replied that she hadn't. He replied that the shield could withstand an A-rank strike but no more, and that he could only draw a true torrent from it with his hands through touch. Martin Verlaine said that was the answer. He said that a pure line removes the ceiling from the line. He said that the second ceiling rests on the medium itself, and that it is set once in a lifetime, in front of everyone and under the bell. He said that the seal sets it. Ray stopped breathing. He remembered the Hall of Seals and the 60 people, and how a circle of black metal clicked once under each one, like a lock. He remembered counting the knots that day on everyone, one after another. Different patterns, different strengths, exactly 10 on each. He remembered realizing what they were doing. There was only one thing he hadn't understood back then. He hadn't understood that they were doing it right here, right now, right before his eyes, and to applause. Martin Verlaine said that the awakening ceremony doesn't grant a class. He said that a person's class is determined at birth. The ceremony reads him and, in that very second, assigns him a measure and records the result. He said that the gray lines in the circle mean that the seal was unable to read the bearer. He said that it assigns a measure anyway, but does so blindly and therefore crookedly, which is why the reader sees the seams. He said that this is the only reason they exist at all. He said there are 109 seals in the Empire, and that all 109 were cast individually and are linked to it, and that it lies in the main vault of the Department of Measurement in the capital, beneath 4 tiers of stone. He called it the root. He said that if the measure were removed from the root, all 109 seals would cease to apply it at that very moment. He said this would change nothing for those already living. He said that everyone who had already undergone the ceremony would remain with their 10 until their very death. He said that only those who had not yet stepped into the circle would be free. Ray sat and counted in the darkness. 60 people a year in Helmvar. 109 seals. He lost count and started over, arriving at a number that was too vast to comprehend. He asked how many people underwent the ceremony in the Empire each year. Martin Verlaine replied that he didn't know exactly, but that during his tenure, the departmental records listed around 40,000. Then he stood up from the floor, took Ray's wrists again, and said he'd rested. He untied the 4th knot and the 5th, and on the 6th, he made a sound for the first time. Ray felt under his fingers that the blind man's left hand had stopped holding on. He spat out the sleeve and ordered him to stop. Martin Verlaine replied that he would not stop. He said he'd spent 19 years in a wheelchair, reading to 4,000 people, and had done nothing during that time. He said his daughter had grown up without him and that he'd recognized her by the scar on her finger. He said he had no intention of sitting in the chair a second time, nor of dying in the mountains, and that there was exactly one thing left he could do better than anyone else alive. He took the 7th. On the 8th, his nose began to bleed, and he didn't bother to wipe it. On the 9th, he fell completely silent and worked in utter stillness, and Ray could hear nothing but his breathing. The 10th was finished just before dawn. Ray called out to Udar. A net rose above his fist in the darkness, and it was clear. He looked at it. There wasn't a single knot in it, and the flow ran through it from his wrist to his fist, smooth and wide, never veering off course. 1,000-fold flow on an F-rank body. He didn't strike. He didn't even clench his fist. He extinguished it after 2 heartbeats and still felt blood trickling from his gums. Martin Verlin sat on the floor, leaning against a chair, and didn't move. Ray called out to him twice. The blind man replied that he was alive and that he needed half an hour. He said the boy had to decide one thing right now and decide it coldly. He said that if Ray left the academy today, he would become a fugitive carrier under the Crown's jurisdiction, and they would search for him throughout the Empire, and he would never make it into the main registry. He said that if Ray got into the carriage on his own, he'd be taken to the capital in 10 days, carried into the register by hand, and seated in a chair 3 tiers above the route. He said there wouldn't be a second chance like this. Ray replied that he'd already made up his mind, and that he decided on the 5th day. Next, he had to take care of 3 things. First, he tied 6 knots with his own hand from the inside and left 4 untied, doing so in such a way that the scanner would register the medium as tied when checked. He now knew how to do both sides. Second, he placed a bundle containing the last 2 blank lines into the blind man's hands and explained where the service gate was and where the rainwater barrel stood by the laundry room. Third, he told him to tell his daughter not to go to the capital, even though he knew she would go. Martin Verlin left before the bell rang. He took his cane and went out through the door that the guard locked from the outside, and Ray never found out how he opened it both times. The morning was clear. 5 wagons stood in the courtyard, 2 of them covered with bars on the windows. The commission was loading boxes containing the originals. Cassius Dern stepped out onto the porch in a travel coat, put on clean gloves, and looked up at the sky. Ray was led out by the arms, seated in the first covered wagon and strapped to a bracket. He looked through the bars at Helmvar's courtyard, where 612 people had been gathered to watch. Halden Work stood holding a journal. Wyran Toll stood at the edge of the platform and did not look at the wagon. Anselm Crowd stood apart from everyone else in his capacity as honorary mentor, his face ashen. Merrick Gast did not come. Selena Morvain stood in the front row with her hands behind her back, and Ray knew that she had under her cloak. Then the door of the second covered wagon slammed shut, and Ray heard a chain rattle inside it. Dern approached his bars and said matter-of-factly that 2 people would be going to the capital. He said that yesterday, in the lower vault's access log, they had found 4 entries for passage to the first row, signed by Morvain, and that all 4 were timed to coincide with the guard logs. He said that for an A-rank archmage with personal access, this was not just some reserve officer, and that she would be transported separately under a different charge. He said he was sorry. Ray pressed his face against the bars and saw that the first row was standing in place and that Selena Morvain was no longer among them. The convoy traveled for 10 days, and Ray counted each one. The first 3 days were spent crossing mountain passes. The wagon jolted along, and he learned the route by sound. Then came the plains and villages, and at the entrance to each one, the commission presented a document, and the village elders bowed before the boxes. On the 7th day, the checkpoints began. On the 9th, the air changed, and it smelled of smoke and the river. The capital came into view from a hill. It was gray and enormous, and there wasn't a single tall building in it except for one. The main structure of the Department of Measurement stood on the low riverbank, and it was not a tower, but a slab, a 6-story rectangle of dark stone without a single window above the first floor. No coat of arms, no columns, no sign. The convoy drove through a blind gate, and the gate closed. Inside was a courtyard without trees, and in that courtyard stood 3 more wagons, being unloaded in silence. Raya was led inside up a wide staircase, and he counted the levels downward rather than upward. He was placed in a room on the 3rd level below ground, not in a chair, on a cot. The door was made of iron with a window, and the room was dry and warm, with a jug of water standing there. He sat there for a full day. During that day, he saw through the window 2 servants and both guards, and realized that here people had 11 knots instead of 10, and the 11th lay on top of the others and was tied not with the seal, but by hand. Here they marked their own. On the 2nd day, they came for him and led him downstairs. The 4th level was a long hall with a vaulted ceiling. Along the walls stood lead cabinets, and inside the cabinets lay not scrolls or tablets, but plates of gray metal. There were thousands of them. At the end of the hall, a man in gray sat at a simple table and was writing. He was nearing 70. He was short and neat, and his hands were bare, his palms stained with ink. The attendant introduced him as the Supreme Weigher, Aiden Worst. He finished the line, set down his quill, looked at Ray, and said he was glad Ray had made it there alive. He said it simply, and Ray immediately realized that standing before him was the most dangerous man he had ever seen. Worst ordered the shackles removed from him and dismissed the guards. He said there was nowhere to run here, and that the boy understood that himself. He said he'd read Cassius Dern's report 4 times, and that the report was poorly written because the inspector didn't understand what he was writing about. He said he wanted to hear it with his own ears. Ray answered him honestly. He didn't hide anything about the plates, the quill, or the source material from the barrel. Worst listened without interrupting and then said that in 400 years there had been 29 readers and that all 29 had reached the line, but not a single one had reached the medium. He said that the boy had reached the medium in 2 months and that this was not talent, but the mindset of a scribe. He stood up and told him to follow him. They descended another level, and he unlocked a low door with his key. Inside was a circular hall with no decoration whatsoever, and in the middle of the floor lay a root. Ray saw it and stopped in the doorway. It was a circle of black metal 3 steps wide, the very same circle as in the Hall of Seals at the Helmvar Academy. Only this one had markings above it. They weren't visible within a palm's width or even 2 paces. They extended upward to the ceiling and downward into the stone. They were layered, with one layer upon another, and Ray began counting them, but gave up at 60. Vorst said there were 412 layers. He explained that every high measurer, during his term of service, adds a layer to the root and weaves it into himself, and that this is done not out of vanity, but out of necessity. He said that the root cannot be torn apart from the outside. He said that it is held together by the living. He said that the vault is currently held by 11 measurers, and that as long as even one of the 11 is alive, the measure stands, and that the boy had already understood this from his expression. Ray understood. He stood in the doorway, looking at the 412 layers, and considered the only way. 11 people. Vorst let him think it through to the end, and then said that now he would show him the second half. They went back up to the 4th tier, and he opened one of the lead cabinets, took out 3 gray plates, and placed them on the table. He said these were pre-war accounting records. He said that before the empire was established, there were 42 domains. He read aloud for a long time, and Ray listened, unable to object. Worst read accounts of how a single bearer, at full strength, had burned 4 cities on the Tarm River in 9 days, how 12,000 men had been mustered against him, and how only 100 of the 12,000 had returned. He read that, 190 years before the measure, the population of these lands had declined 3 times, and not due to famine. He read about the treaty with the Year of the Two Realms and about how the measure was a condition of peace and that it had been adopted not by kings but by the bearers themselves because there was no other way to live. He set the tablet aside and said that the boy would now say that everything had changed over the past 400 years. He said that was true and that the measure had changed as well, that under the first measurers it had been 4 steps, but now it was 10, and that each successive set of rules had tightened it because tightening was easier than explaining. He said he didn't consider himself in the right. He said he considered himself bound to act. Then he made a proposal, and Ray heard in it an echo of the office in the Academy Tower. Forst said there were 11 measurers, that according to the charter there should be 12, and that the 12th seat had been vacant for 9 years. He said that the reader in that position would have overturned the work of the code. He said that the measure applies equally to everyone today, to the plowman, the healer, and the murderer, because the code is blind and cannot distinguish. He said that the reader can. He said that Ray could lift the measure from one person at a time and do so legally and do so for his entire life, and that over 40 years of service, through his hands, 10,000 freed souls would have passed through his hands. He said he was offering neither a deal nor protection, but a job. He said that, as a first step, the boy could lift the measure from the Empire's 74 infirmaries, and that he himself would sign off on it today. Ray was silent for a very long time. He was silent because it was the best offer he had ever heard, and because it was an honest one. Then he asked about the wall. He asked where the registry assigned those with a 0 reading and those struck from the general registry. Worst answered immediately, without looking away. He said to the Eastern line. He said that closed lists were compiled into the registry, that there had been 9 of them over the past 40 years, and that each contained between 60 and 100 people. He said that these people were placed in the 2nd tier because they weren't officially recorded and because their deaths wouldn't affect the records. He said he had personally signed 6 such lists. He said that if Ray took the 12th spot, he would sign those lists too, and that he wouldn't hide that from him. Ray asked when the next list was leaving. Worst said in a month, that it contained 80 people, and that Helmvar was contributing 11 to it. And then Ray stopped weighing his options. He remembered how long he'd lain beneath the rubble by the eastern bastion, how slowly time had passed, and how people walked past the rubble without clearing away the stones, because there was no record-keeping in the 2nd row. He looked up and said he was refusing. He said he wouldn't be the 12th, and that he wouldn't free one of the hands of the person who was simultaneously signing the lists. He said he'd come here for the root. Aiden Worst listened to this calmly and without offense. He said he was sorry and that the offer remained open for 40 days. He called the guard and ordered them to take the carrier back to the 3rd tier, adding that the boy was free to walk about the 4th tier during the day and that he had nowhere to run anyway. He said that no one was kept in chains here except for the dangerous ones. Raya was led away, and on the staircase between the levels, he heard footsteps below and turned around. Selena Morvain was being led down the lower passageway. She was walking on her own, her hands unbound, and a servant in gray walked beside her, speaking to her politely. Around her neck lay a thin band of dull metal, about a finger's width. She raised her head, saw Ray, and stopped. The attendant stopped as well and did not rush her. She said loudly and very calmly that she had been offered a place in the vault and 3 days to think it over. She said she had already given her answer. She said she had agreed. Selena was led further down the lower passageway, and she did not look back. Ray was taken up to the 3rd tier and locked in, and he sat there motionless until dark. He picked her words apart and pieced them back together all night long. She had said it aloud. She had stopped first. She had stood so that he could see the ring. Archmage Branches, a rank A mage who had been at the top of his class for 4 years and never got up before the bell announcing his surrender across the entire flight of stairs. By morning, he'd decided to believe her. He spent the entire day on the 4th level. First cut. Over the course of 6 days, he read 19 servants and all 11 measurers one by one in the Hall of Plates, because they all descended to the root according to schedule. Second cut. He discovered that the 11th knot among his own people was not a measure. It was a tether. The measurer wove his layer into the root, and from that day on, the root held him, and he held the root. Third insight. He grasped the crux of the matter on the 6th day, sitting on the floor by the lead cabinet. The tether was a line. The line was superimposed by the measure of the same blueprint as everything else, so it could be removed. And the freed measurer stopped holding on to the root, not because he was dying, but because the thread was snapping on the other end. Fourth cut. He tested this on a living person. The junior measurer's name was Tobias Wren. He was 23 years old, had been there for 4 years, and stuttered. Ray approached him in the plate room and asked for help reaching the bottom drawer. He held his wrist and stepped inside. The restraint was thin and new. He removed it in a minute and didn't touch anything else. Tobias Wren pulled his hand away, looked at his palm, then at Ray, said nothing, and walked away quickly. 2 hours later, he returned, sat down next to him on the floor, and sat there in silence for half an hour. Then he said that for 4 years, every night, he'd felt as if something were pulling him down, and he'd thought that was how it was for everyone. He said that today, for the first time in 4 years, he hadn't felt it. He asked what would happen now. Ray replied that he no longer held the root, and that they would find out during the next check in 9 days. Tobias Wren thought for a moment and said that 9 days was a long time. On the 9th day, everything happened all at once. In the morning, Selena Morvain came to see him on the 3rd level, openly and carrying a piece of paper, and the guards let her through because she was wearing her own headband around her neck. She placed the paper on the bunk and began to speak quietly and very quickly. She said that the headband wasn't a restraint, but a probationary period, and that they would weave it into the root in 18 days. She said that in 9 days, she'd gained access to the lower passageway and copied the reconciliation schedule. She said that today, at the 4th hour, 9 of the 11 inspectors would descend to the root for a general reconciliation, and that this happened 3 times a year. She said that last, and at that, Ray got up from his bunk. She said that yesterday, detainees from the northern route had been brought to the vault according to the inventory list. There were 3 of them: a blind old man with a cane, a girl from the infirmary at Helmvar Academy, and a senior master of the combat corps with 2 fingers on his left hand. At the 4th hour, he went downstairs. He wasn't stopped on the stairs because daytime hours were still in effect. He was stopped at the low doorway to the circular hall, where 2 guards were standing, and for the first time in 2 months, Ray used his class in front of others without any caution. He grabbed the first one by the wrist and stripped him of his measure entirely in 9 heartbeats. The C-rank guard received his stream all at once, couldn't withstand it, and slumped to the floor unconscious. The second one managed to sound the alarm. Ray stripped the measure from him as well. This one remained on his feet, opened the door himself, and then sat down against the wall and began to cry, unable to explain why. Down below, at the base of the circle, stood 9 executioners and Aiden Worst. They turned toward the door. What followed were 30 minutes that Ray later could not recall in sequence. He walked along the circle, taking them by the hand one by one, removing their restraints and touching nothing but the restraints. 3 offered their hands of their own accord. 2 recoiled, and he took them by force. With 4 of his own strike's knots undone, it wasn't difficult. 1 struck him in the face and split his eyebrow. Two ran toward the stairs, and he didn't pursue them because they were no longer needed. Tobias Wren stood in the corner and didn't. The layers above the root began to fade. They didn't fade quickly. They faded from top to bottom, one by one, and each one faded with a dry click, and the clicks grew more frequent. Of the 412, about 100 remained when the vault's guard entered the hall from above. There were 15 of them. They were not servants but soldiers, and they wore gray armor. And at that moment, the passageway behind them brightened. Gwyn Ortis entered the circular hall first. He was unarmed, and in his right hand burned the heavy palm, with 10 of its knots removed. Martin Verlin had stripped him of everything in the basement an hour ago. The master did not strike at the people. He struck the vaulted ceiling above the passageway, causing it to collapse and blocking the entrance, while he himself remained outside with the 15. Ista Verlin fought her way inside through the rubble, and her branch stood above her, white and gold, and she held the passageway open with it just long enough for Martin Verlin to enter follow. Then things took a turn for the worse. Aiden Wurst hadn't moved or called out to anyone the whole time. He walked right up to the circle itself, placed both palms on it, and wove himself directly into it. The remaining 90 layers rose at once and reached toward him, and the root exhaled. A surge shot upward from the circle. It was not the power of the bearer. It was the measure of 412 years concentrated into a single point, and it traveled through the hall in a ring, with Ista Verlin standing in its path. Ray managed to do one thing. He shouted for her to raise a shield, and she raised the basic first-year shield she'd learned from the clean line he'd written with his left hand while sitting in the chair. The ring entered that shield and stopped. It didn't bend it. It stood within it and pressed. And from the pressure, all the lamps in the circular hall burst. Cracks spread across the walls, and stone rained down from the ceiling. The shield held. Ista stood on one knee, her palm raised, blood trickling from beneath her fingernails. She held it for 9 heartbeats. On the 9th, the ring went out. And in those 9 heartbeats, Ray reached Aiden Wurst and grabbed him by the wrists. Wurst didn't struggle. He told him to his face that he had woven the 12th layer of the root into himself, voluntarily, 41 years ago, and that it could only be removed with his consent, and that consent would not be given. He said that the boy could kill him, and that then the root would take root anew in the 10th Reaper and the 9th, and that they would be found and brought back. He said that this was the only reason there were always 11 executioners. Ray held his wrists and realized he wasn't lying. He let go of his hands and took a step back. The blockage in the passageway had been cleared from the outside, and a guard detail descended into the hall, accompanied by Cassius Dern. It was quiet behind the rubble. Gwyn Ortis lay in the passageway beneath a rock, and the heavy hand above his arm had already gone out. He'd held off 15 men for 4 minutes, and the ceiling, which he'd brought crashing down himself, had been enough. Ista crawled toward him over the rock and called for healing, and the river flowed but found nothing alive within him to enter. She called to him 7 times. Martin Verlin sat down next to her on the floor, placed a hand on her shoulder, and stopped her from calling an 8th time. Ray stood in the middle of the circular hall beneath the extinguished layers, watching it all, and reckoned that what remained. 11 executioners have been removed. The 12th layer stands and is held up by a single man who will not give his consent. The master is dead. The guard is upstairs. Dern is at the door. And then Aiden Wurst said, in the silence, the first thing Ray hadn't expected. He said he was asking to be shown the markings. Ray looked at him and didn't understand. Wurst repeated himself. He said that in 41 years of service and 70 years of life, he had never seen the markings even once. He said that the chief measurer couldn't read. He said that all the work on the vault was done according to blueprints instruments, and rules that had been copied from slab to slab for 400 years. He said he had taken measurements 12,000 times and had done so blindly, following instructions, just as any servant does blindly. He said that over the course of 400 years, the vault had found and removed 29 readers, and that not a single one of them had ever been asked anything by any chief measurer. He said he'd only realized this today when the boy walked along the circle and removed from the 9 people what none of the 9 could see. He held out his hands, palms up. Ray took them. He didn't remove anything. He did what he'd done the first time with Istia in the ravine, and what he'd done with Gwyn Ortis behind the tower wall. He opened his vision to him through touch and let him see through his eyes. Aiden Wurst stood there, looking at the root, at the 90 remaining layers, and at the 12th layer that extended from the circle and receded into his chest. He looked at it for a long time. Then he asked to be shown the people, and Ray turned his head and showed him Tobias Wren by the wall, Cassia Dern by the door, and the guards on the stairs. On each one were 11 knots, and one was driven in on top of the others like a nail. Then Wurst asked to be shown the girl. Ista Verlin was sitting on a rock next to the dead man. Her branch had been extinguished, and there wasn't a single knot on her markings, because Ray had removed them all back at the academy and then again in the mountains through her father, and they no longer grew back. Wurst looked at her longer than he had at the root. He said that for 400 years, the Codex had stated in its statutes that a full flow meant war. He said that when he looked at the full flow, he saw a man who had just been holding the ring of measure in his palm to prevent it from flowing further down the hall. Ray let go of his hands. Forst stood there a little longer and then said he agreed. He stated 2 conditions. First, he said he would leave along with the root, and that this was not a sacrifice, but a matter of accounting, because a person woven into 412 layers would not survive their separation after 41 years, and he knew this better than anyone. He spoke the second condition slowly. He said that the 12th place in the Codex must remain occupied. He said that the measure would depart, and that along with it would go what had kept a hand on everyone's shoulder for 400 years. He said that the first few years would be difficult, and that this would be a fact, not an opinion, and that someone would have to sit at the empty circle and sort out what would come of it. He said he had no right to demand this of the boy, and that he was merely asking. Ray gave his word. He removed the 12th layer that very hour. He did it slowly, and Aiden Wurst stood perfectly still and made not a sound. He did not die immediately, but 3 hours later, upstairs in his room, with Tobias Wren sitting beside him, writing down his final instructions, for the old man dictated the order of succession right up to the end. The root went out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This was seen not only in the vault. In the 109 halls of the Empire, at the very same hour, the black circles clicked once, like locks, and went out. In Helmwar, at that very moment, in the Hall of Seals, the floor was being mopped, and a servant dropped his bucket, a story he would recount for 20 years. The measure did not depart from the living. Not a single knot was untied in any of those who had already stepped into the circle. And in this, Martin Verlin was right to the very end. Only one thing changed. Not a single seal of the Empire ever again imposed the measure upon anyone. The first year was just as Vorst had promised. In the fall, in 4 counties, young bearers of the First Awakening, lacking the measure, could not contain their own flow and perished, taking 19 others with them. In the winter, on the coast, a bearer of full fire burned down 2 streets, and it took 3 days to subdue him. The registry compiled reports on these incidents, and Ray read each one, signed them, and never took his eyes off them. He introduced something into the registry that hadn't existed there for 400 years. He introduced training. By the third year, there were 40 schools operating in the empire, where new bearers were taught to control the power they were now given in its entirety. And the first teachers at these schools were among the 11 executioners he had released from their bonds. The Eastern Line did not receive a restricted list. Cassius Dern revoked it himself 11 days after the route was extinguished, doing so with his own signature and without being asked. And for 3 years afterward, he was held accountable for this before the crown. He became neither a friend nor an enemy. He remained an inspector and visited the Arch twice a year, arguing with Ray over every document, and both of them acknowledged that the other was necessary. The Eastern Bastion held firm. It held in the third year when they took it seriously. 109 men held it for 11 days, and all but 9 returned. They had their shields repaired. Merrick Gast sent 4 19-year-long distribution logs for the bastions to the archives and attached a letter in which he wrote that the names in them had been erased with a stylus and that he had reconstructed 460 of them from memory and requested that they be entered into the memorial list under his signature. Then he resigned and left, and Ray did not seek him out. Archivist Nolt remained in the lower vault of Helmvar. The Department of Measure no longer existed, but his position had not been abolished, and he continued to receive his salary according to the old payroll for another 9 years. He sat under a single lamp in the hall where now any student could take any scroll without any authorization, and to the very end he believed he was doing his job correctly. Once a year, he wrote a report for the registry that no one read. Dorian Kress brought his father to the capital in his second year. Ista Verlin worked on him for 4 days. His hand hadn't grown back. She gave him back what the measure had taken from him before, his hand, and the man who had been drinking for 8 years and repeating the same thing over and over stopped saying it, and a year later returned to duty as an instructor. Dorian never thanked Ray once, and they never became friends. He had paid his debt with an open gate, and they both knew it. Selena Morvain didn't weave herself into the route because there was nowhere left to weave. She left the Arch with her measure removed, and 6 months later took the fall royal selection without giving up a single step. After that, the selections were canceled for 4 years until the rules were rewritten. She came to the Arch every spring and asked the same question every time. She asked how many there were now. Ray would name the number of those freed that year, and she would nod and leave. Martin Verlin lived another 6 years. His sight never returned. He took a position in the dome that hadn't existed before and taught the readers. Over the course of 6 years, he found 9 people, and all 9 were among those to whom the seal had once given gray lines and marked as reserves. He died in the spring in his room, passing away in his sleep. Ista Verlin remained. She ran the infirmary in the vault and saved so many people in the first 5 years that they stopped keeping a separate count. She brought back 4 of those who had been brought in dead, and after the 4th, she said she would no longer count even that. She met Kilaverta 11 years later on the Northern Highway. He was healthy and working as a cart driver, and he didn't recognize her. Garland Osh served out his years and retired. He came to visit once a year and always brought the same awkward bottle. Varan Toll left Helmvar in his second year and became the first master of the first of the 40 schools. Garm Odd died in his guardhouse at a very advanced age, and until the very end, he showed the newcomers a cracked oak pillar and told them about the boy from the reserve, but no one believed him. Anselm Crowd returned as rector for exactly 6 months, solely to sign the Academy's new charter, and then left of his own accord. Gwen Ortis was buried in Helmvar by the eastern wall, and instead of his rank, a number was carved into the stone: 211. He himself explained to Ray what that number meant in a closed hall on the first day and never returned to the subject. Ray Olvin took 12th place and held onto it for 41 years. He did not become strong. He kept 4 of the removed nodes for himself and never touched the remaining 6 once in his entire life, because an F-rank body could no longer absorb them and because he no longer needed them. His strength had never lain in the flow. He read, he wrote. He took measurements from the living, and over the course of 41 years he measured 19,412 people, keeping track of them by hand and knowing the final number by heart until his very death. A year after the route had faded, he arrived in Helmvar. It was autumn, the 13th day of the month of gold, and in the Hall of Seals stood 63 people in gray cloaks without insignia. He climbed to the upper gallery for attendance and stood at the railing. Below, the administrator, Halden Work, opened the register and announced that the seal would accept everyone on the list. He announced that the class was granted once and could not be changed. He announced nothing more because the remaining words had been struck from the old formula that summer. The circle clicked once beneath each person like a lock, and above the circle rose wings and trees and figures in white, and they were brighter than a year ago, the difference visible even from the gallery. 29th on the list was a skinny boy from the outskirts. He stepped into the circle, and the lines beneath him turned gray. The hall fell silent, and the silence lasted exactly 7 heartbeats, and Ray knew there would be 7. Then there was laughter from below. The boy raised his head toward the gallery. Ray met his gaze and didn't look away. He raised his hand, touched his temple with 2 fingers, and ran them downward. The boy didn't know this sign. He would learn it in a week when he went down to the lower vault and the old man under the lamp told him that the gray lines appeared once in a generation. The sign was the same. It meant nothing more.